So, good morning and welcome to the Aga Khan Center and to the Aga Khan Library. My name is Leif Stenberg. I'm the director of the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations, and I have the pleasure and honor to welcome you to the building and to this conference. As you all know, the role of the director is to do these kind of introductions, and I'm actually at two conferences at the same time, so I will be running in and out between the two of them, but I am very sincere when I am introducing this one, and I also will start by saying a few words about AKU, then going over to why this is important. But first I would like, before otherwise I will miss it, I would like to thank everyone involved for preparing this, Walid and all the others at the staff of the library, as well as IT and our part of the University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations. For those of you who are here for the first time, Aga Khan University is a very young university. It was established in 1983, and it's one out of two universities that is part of the Aga Khan Development Network, which is the largest development network, or the second largest development network in the world, of about 80,000 employees. So today the university consists of about 15,000 persons, employees. It's only 3,500 students, but that is because this is universities which is very heavy on medicine, nursing and education, especially medicine. I think the university today contains 6 or 7 hospitals. So that's the tradition. We in London are the unique part of the university, a part that is doing the study of Muslim civilizations, from anything like the discipline of archaeology to very contemporary political science or Islamic studies. So here in London we do have an MA program in Muslim cultures. For those of you who are interested, there is a prospectus for 2019 over there, and there are of course other informations about the university and us in the leaflet you have received, or the folder you have received. If we have a master program, we can say that we don't have any undergraduate studies, and we are just now applying in order to start up a PhD program. But this type of organization then means that most of our faculty do a lot of research. We are a research-heavy institution. We have a publication series together with Edinburgh University Press, and we do a lot of outreach. I don't know how to qualify this one, but it's kind of semi-part of the outreach activity. So there is a lot of outreach that goes in terms of seminars or public lectures. And if you would like to know more about that, please talk to any one of the employees who are around you, and they will help you sign up for the email info letter. As it is, Aga Khan University is a kind of, I think, unknown part of the academic context in London. And when I was hired a year and a half ago, one of my tasks I was given was to partly increase research, but also normalize the institution. The university is denominational, but at the same time it's not particularly well known. So we are now trying to set up a lot of collaboration with a number of universities and partners in London as well as globally. It should also be noted that the network of AKDN, which I mentioned earlier, includes another newly started university, the University of Central Asia. So in the new building, AKC, I think it's very interesting because it's the first time I think the name of the Aga Khan institutions are on a public building, or not on a public building, but on a building. And the point is to say that when I was hired, I was here in London for interviews, but I couldn't find the place. I passed by it, and then I went back again. And, oh, there, somewhere there is the institute. So now we have the name on the door, and that it's another type of visibility, which also I think gives us a kind of or oblige us in a way to be more present in the public discussions on what's going on in Muslim contexts. So we are increasing, or we have increased public events quite a lot the last year, 2018 and now 2019. Saying a few words about faculty and research as well. The research side is important and the normalizing process has been going on. So just in the end of last year, we received an European Research Council grant and we have a couple of British Academy grants. So we've been quite successful from 2017 and onwards in receiving funding from granting institutions in the UK and Europe. I think that's important, and if you would like to have more information about this, you can always find it on our somewhat enigmatic but still existing homepage. The library then. I think the library is an important institution in the academic world, of course, but in this case, I think it's the gem of the building. So I hope you all will, if you haven't been there before, will be taken on a tour of the building from the top to, not the bottom, but at least to the library. The library is the gem in the sense that we have an ambition, and I'm not so fond of using this type of idea saying that we aim to do a world-class library. Yes, not so fond of saying that because I'm Scandinavian. There is a certain humbleness in the way you express yourself, but it's actually the ambition. And I think we are two institutions, the Institute for Islamic Studies and the Aga Khan University, have an ambition to actually build this kind of world-class library. One important aspect of that is, of course, that we do have the resources. So resources are always important. And in that sense, we can, with a common ambition, do what we need to do in terms of acquisitions, and we can plan accordingly for having a library that is specialized in certain fields, but will then be a very good service to scholars in all kinds of Islamic studies or Muslim study of the Muslim civilizations. So I'm very proud of the work of our head librarian, Walid Ghali, and I believe that through collaboration with the institutions in the building, but also with other academic institutions, and with the relevant funding, and with certain smartness, we will be able to reach that goal of developing a really modern library in which we can say that, okay, the library is not only a servant to scholars, but it's also a producer of academic knowledge as well as part of the discussion on academia. And I think this type of event is a very good example when the library take the kind of command and organizes something which is then developing and will developing also knowledge, not only just a kind of passive receiver or servant to scholarly work. So with those words, I would like to leave the floor to the head librarian, who is also an assistant professor at the Aga Khan University. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Leif, for this introduction. And I always tell Leif since I met him that he's a librarian by heart. He would have loved to be a librarian one day. So, I mean, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for accepting our invitations for the seminar today. My name, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Walid Ghali, the head of the Aga Khan Library in London. I would like to welcome you to the Aga Khan Center and the first event at the Aga Khan Library in 2019. Hopefully we'll have a series of events very soon to be shared with you. Since the inauguration of the Aga Khan Library in its new location in June 2018, and with the new identity and name that were given to the library, we were thinking of how we could contribute to the safeguarding of the Islamic Studies collections and the profession that looks after these collections. This profession, as you probably know, emerged and developed alongside the fields of Orientalism and Islamic and Middle Eastern studies in Europe. And institutions offering Islamic and Middle Eastern studies were established in France, Germany, and the UK in the 17th century, with a strong collection of resources to support their mandates. For instance, the idea of a school specializing in Oriental studies in Great Britain was first proposed in 1798 in a report by Richard Wellesley, Governor General of India, but it was not until 1917 that the School of Oriental and African Studies and its library collection opened in London. It's worth mentioning that the idea of this seminar did not come out of the blue, of course. But there were previous initiatives that happened over the last 2 decades. It's also a strategic objective, as Leif said, for us at the Aga Khan Library to support and participate in these endeavors. In the following few minutes, I will mention 3 major initiatives that I know, up to my knowledge. In 1983, Professor Ian Nathan, who was supposed to be with us today, but he sends his apologies for his absence due to unavoidable circumstances. He published Middle East materials in the United Kingdom and Irish Library, a directory. This work was well received, and 15 years later, Malcolm, the Middle East Libraries Committee in the UK, supported a revised edition of the same directory published in 1998 with the title Middle East Sources, a Malcolm Guide to Middle Eastern and Islamic Books and Materials in the United Kingdom and Irish Libraries. Although the directory does not claim to be a comprehensive survey of the UK Middle Eastern and Islamic collections, it does represent an excellent sources for students, scholars, and librarians. This is a well-known example of the support from professional institutions such as Malcolm to the Islamic Studies libraries. And I'm sure that we will hear more stories and interesting stories of a similar ilk from our eminent scholars and speakers today. My second example is on advocacy level. In 2012, a small working conference was organized at Yale University in conjunction with Duke and Columbia University Libraries. The conference was entitled International and Area Studies Collections in 21st Century Libraries. Librarians and academic leaders in the area studies field gathered to discuss common challenges and to identify strategic areas for joint action. The idea for the conference emerged as a result of the growing number of librarians with director-level responsibility of international and area studies collections. They found they faced similar issues and challenges within their respective departments, but had few opportunities to discuss issues of common concern with other colleagues who supervise area studies across the United States. In brief, the conference participants identified 4 broad areas of common concern. The first area is the financial constraints, including the defunding of the government program to support area studies activities at the university level. The second one is the access to digital content. And thirdly, recruitment, training, and retention of area studies specialists. And finally, the development of models for successful collaboration, including collection development, digitizations, and shared expertise. You shall notice, perhaps from our conversations today, that some of these challenges have become exacerbated in our days. My final example is another alarm bell. Our colleague, Anais Solomon, from the Islamic Studies Library at McGill University, investigated the ambivalent identity of librarians supporting Middle Eastern and Islamic studies in North America, Western Europe, and the North American and European institutions in the Middle East. Building on previous studies as well as surveying these libraries, Anais' paper threw light on the challenges that the field is facing, from the decrease in funding that affects collection development, of course, to the lack of trained librarians to replace retired professionals. What I have mentioned above are amazing initiatives, but they are alarm signals too. If we look at the time gaps between these initiatives, this indicates that we need to create more organized and structured efforts if we wish to preserve the collections and the profession. Also, you may have noticed that the emphasis in these initiatives has been more on the Middle East Studies collection. And you would agree with me that more work needs to be done on the Islamic Studies area, which covers a wider range of geographical, historical, and social issues. I hope that I succeeded to frame the idea of today's seminar briefly, but I also hope that one of the achievements today is to send a wake-up call to policymakers and academic leaders. Islamic studies cannot survive without Islamic collections, and equally, Islamic collections cannot survive without curators and trained librarians. And without further ado, I once again welcome our honored speakers and guests, and thank you very much for your coming today. And before I leave the stage to our guest speaker, Dr. Arnold, I just need to make a few announcements about the fire exit. We have no fire drills planned today, so if you heard the alarm, please just follow the fire marshals and the main stairs outside. Secondly, the toilets are just on your right-hand side once you come out of this room. There will be lunch and dinners. At 12:30 we'll be serving light lunch, and 5 will be serving dinners. There is filming and photographies are in the room. Please, if you don't like to be in the photos, just let us know or just send us an email. There will be tours during lunch hours across the building, gardens and library and terraces. But towards the end of the day, you will have tours in the library, more elaborated tours in the library. And thank you very much once again.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I now invite you to the first panel. The first panel will have 2 papers. The procedure is that we shall have both papers, I think 25 minutes each. Okay. And then we shall have 10 minutes at the end before lunch. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Paul Ochterlony. He is Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies librarian at the University of Exeter. He will be telling us, that's his title, 50 years of Middle Eastern Libraries Committee and 40 years as a librarian. And there is an enigmatic subtitle to that, which we shall, perhaps he will elaborate on. So, Paul.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. That's the thanks. The apologies to various people, Arnoud, Dominique, Wasim. They've heard this one before, I'm afraid. It's a survey of my career, it's a parallel to what Arnoud has looked at, and you'll have to decide at the end of it whether my presentation or Arnoud's is the more depressing of the two. Right. The 1960s are often seen as the beginning of the modern era, when Britain woke up from its post-war slumber and entered a period of dynamic and radical change, propelled forward by the white heat of technology, as Prime Minister Harold Wilson had it in 1963. Much of this view is valid, and for example, there was the Hayter Committee in 1961, which reported on area studies, and which funded the creation of area studies throughout the UK. These area studies were designed to marry expertise in the social sciences with the traditional staples of Orientalism. This feeling of change in the early 1960s was also influenced by the Robbins Report on Higher Education, which led to a whole host of new universities such as Warwick, York, Sussex and Lancaster, which were hotbeds of innovation in curriculum design, academic structure and modernist architecture. Yet, at the same time, many institutions in the 1960s did not react that strongly to the winds of change. When I first went up to Oxford in 1967 to read Arabic, the students in the year preceding mine studied single honours Arabic without having to read any literature later than Ibn Khaldun. My year was the first year to read the classics of modern Arabic literature such as Najib Mahfouz, Tawfiq al-Hakim and Taha Hussein. But there was also no consideration at the time of students spending a year abroad in an Arab country. British academic libraries were also fairly backward in the 1960s. For most, the most recent innovation was the card catalogue, but in Oxford, as in Leiden, apparently, the Bodleian Library was still happily printing out and pasting up new catalogue entries into its wonderfully old-fashioned guard book catalogue. Get I'm going to get another slide. There we go. At the University of Exeter, quoting from Jeremy Black's fascinating New History of the University, The City on the Hill, a new sociology lecturer arriving at the university in 1967 reminisced, Exeter was above all very small. I remember thinking on first visiting the then new library that it felt more like the library at my grammar school than the University Library in Cambridge or the Widener in Harvard, where I'd been accustomed to working. In sociology, there were only 3 telephones and the switchboard closed down at lunchtime. There was nothing resembling a modern photocopier, just a wet, dry contraption which involved making a sandwich of your text between 2 types of negative paper, which was then run through a sort of mangle into a bath of developing fluid, one then pegged out the result on a washing line to dry slowly. Another former colleague who arrived at the University of Exeter in 1966 felt that, I quote, "The prevailing philosophy was one that saw the university as a community of individual scholars. Collegiality was a word often used and deeply felt by some people. Collegiality meant in practice that scholars got on with their own work, showed a polite but not intrusive interest in the work of their colleagues, and passed over in silence those whose personal or academic qualities were found to be wanting. There was no effective supervision of courses, degree programs, or research productivity, while the system of tenure meant that no one could be sacked and no questions were asked of those who produced nothing. Teaching was never discussed, and the assumption was that a scholar would automatically be a good teacher." Well, I completed my degree in 1970, spent a year as a junior cataloguer and graduate trainee at SOAS, and then did a postgraduate diploma in library studies at University College London between 71 and 72, a course where technology, management and reader services were hardly taught at all, the emphasis being strongly on cataloguing, classification and subject bibliography. Against this background of cosy convention, the creation of Malcolm UK in 1967 and later its fellow area studies committees such as SCOLMA for Africa and SALG for South Asia was a major engine for change. For the first time, British academics and librarians working on the Middle East were brought together regularly through Melcom, and the collaborative and supportive network of Middle Eastern librarianship had already been made clear to me even as a graduate trainee in 1970-71. Not only did library school lecturer John McElwain send one of his current students to talk to me about going to UCL so that I could benefit from John's special option on Asia, but Jim Pearson, the librarian of SOAS and the founding editor of Index Islamicus, actually drove me in his car from London to Oxford to attend a bibliographical seminar, which resulted in Malcolm's first publication, seen here, Middle Eastern Islam, a Bibliographical Introduction, which came out in 1972. Now, I graduated from UCL in 1972 and was very lucky to be employed almost immediately at the new University of Lancaster, which had, with the help of a 7-year grant from the University of Kuwait, set up a Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. The department never had more than 3 staff at any one time, nor more than a couple of postgraduates and a handful of undergraduates, which had the advantage that I was rarely under pressure, but the disadvantage of limited contact with other people working on the Middle East. The management of the university library was quite innovative, if rather remote. There was a library research unit, for example, whose 2 members of staff, Jeff Ford and Peter Brophy, both ended up as university librarians. Assistant librarians, such as myself, could attend boards of study by right. We undertook duties as moral tutors to students and were entitled to study leave. I used my 9 months leave partly to make an acquisitions trip to Cairo and partly to undertake an exchange with a librarian at the University of Bethlehem. Fortunately, membership of library and academic organizations was positively encouraged by the management at Lancaster. Not only Melcom, which I attended for the first time in November 72, but I also went to the annual conferences of the British Society of Middle Eastern Studies regularly and the World of Islam Festival conferences and exhibitions of 1976. Although isolation was an issue, I did learn a considerable amount about work as a subject librarian from my colleagues at Lancaster, and particularly Peter Burnett, the librarian for Russian and Central European Studies. And I reproduce a chart from a Malcolm publication of 1982, Collections in British Libraries on Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, which I adapted from work Peter had prepared and which I then incorporated into my chapter in the forenamed publication. And I also included, the role of the chart here does not assign values to the different activities of the subject librarian, but the article, and in a second one published in the same collection, it would become clear that cataloguing, classification and collection development took up the greater part of my time. But Malcolm was also an invaluable part of professional development, particularly after I succeeded Derek Hopwood as secretary in the mid-1970s. Malcolm in the 1970s had three major areas of activity. Firstly, the committee had developed an area specialization with a particular emphasis on grey literature, newspapers and periodicals. SOAS, for example, was allocated Iran and North Africa, and Oxford was allocated Jordan, Lebanon, Syria and Turkey. Libraries put a lot of effort into the scheme, but because of the difficulties of selection, supply, staffing and finance, it was not always possible to sustain the programme. Later research, which looked at British acquisitions from the mid-1970s, showed that, I quote, none of the libraries in the area specialisation scheme had significant holdings of modern academic books from their countries, unquote. And it's probably also worth pointing out that grey literature from a wide variety of Middle Eastern countries was being collected at the time by the Middle East Documentation Unit at the University of Durham from 1970 and the Arab World Documentation Unit at Exeter University from 1979. Interesting, when a similar research project was undertaken 20 years later, it was found that the area specialisation scheme had become much more effective. And SOAS's coverage of Moroccan publications and Exeter's of Saudi books, for example, were substantial, even when compared with the level of North American acquisitions, and represented a much improved level of investment. Secondly, Malcolm invested heavily in publishing. In addition to the two books mentioned above, they published collective bibliography such as Arab Islamic Bibliography, Bibliographical Guide to Iran, an Introductory Guide to Middle Eastern and Islamic Bibliography, individual bibliographies on subjects like Halakhalas on the Intifada, separate guides to Arabic, to Persian and to Turkic periodicals, a guide to photographic collections on the Middle East, and various short guides on specific subjects such as official publications, Arabic biographical dictionaries and book selection and acquisition, and two guides to Middle Eastern collection of British libraries, both already mentioned, both authored by Ian Netton, the second of which was published in 1998 and represents, as far as I know, Malcolm's last published contribution to the world of Middle Eastern scholarship. And thirdly, Malcolm worked closely with other organisations, not so much with other area studies library groups, but rather with other societies involved in the study of the Middle East, particularly the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, or BRISMES, which had been founded in 1973. For many years, indeed, until very recently, Malcolm held its summer meeting in conjunction with BRISMES, and Malcolm also contributed regularly to the Society's periodical, initially called the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies Bulletin, and from 1991, the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. And between 1975 and 2008, these journals reviewed a wide variety of bibliographies, manuscript catalogues and other reference works put forward by Malcolm. In fact, there were over 300 reviews of these reference works, with a high point in the 1980s when over 20 different titles were reviewed in a single issue. But the most significant collaboration was Malcolm UK's venture into Europe in 1979, when a small group of librarians led by Derek Hopwood and Jim Pearson visited Aix-en-Provence to hold the first Malcolm International Conference hosted by Marie-Jo Bianchi. It was a memorable occasion, a particular highlight that I recall anyway, being the sight of Cambridge librarian, the sadly missed Robin Bidwell, who almost set his beard alight when he fell asleep in an afternoon session with his lit pipe firmly clamped between his teeth. During the conference, we actually stayed at a university residence at Aix, which had its own vineyard. This struck me as an excellent innovation, but one which is sadly not caught on in British universities. Anyway, it was Malcolm UK's twice yearly meetings and extremely sociable bibliographical seminars which helped to educate me as a Middle East librarian in a way that Lancaster University was unable to do. All the more so since when I returned from study leave in Egypt in 1980, I found that in my absence, the Department of Arabic had been disbanded and I had, in the words of the Vice-Chancellor, been retooled as a law librarian. No disrespect to the University of Lancaster's law department, but I was delighted when I obtained the post a year later as subject librarian for Middle East Studies at the University of Exeter. Well, John Sterling had introduced a structure of subject librarians, and this is really the essence of my talk. of subject librarians when he became university librarian at Exeter in the early 1970s. In 1981, when I arrived there were 18 such subject librarians, although many of them combined their subject work with other duties such as running the acquisitions department or reader services. Exeter had a much greater critical mass in Middle Eastern studies than Lancaster, with a Centre for Arab Gulf Studies, the documentation unit, and innovative courses in Middle Eastern politics, as well as the more traditional Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. A new main library was opened in 1983, and the librarian had originally intended that the subject librarian should work in an open plan office behind the issue desk, but a mass process resulted in mobile offices being built among the book stacks nearest one's subject. This led to a much greater level of inquiries and engagement with academic staff and students. And although reference inquiries increased, and despite the introduction with my colleague Stuart McWilliam of a course in reader instruction and Middle Eastern politics, my life as a subject librarian, however, even during the 80s, was still dominated by cataloguing, classification, and collection development. It is interesting to note that even in the larger libraries of the United States, the situation was not so different in the late 1980s. As a glance at the table there, taken from an article by Don Australia of Ohio State Universities, was entitled A Day in the Life of a Middle East Studies Librarian, will show, you can see, cataloguing, classification dominate one's work. Two issues which were significantly different at Exeter in the 1980s from Lancaster in the 1970s were finance and automation. Mrs. Thatcher's government was determined to reduce the proportion of GDP made up of state expenditure, and the government's contribution to GDP fell from a high of 45% in 1982 during the Falklands War to a low of 35% in 1990. And during the 1980s, it was difficult to obtain funds for book purchases, serial subscriptions were cut, and travel to conferences was a major issue. Automation was just beginning in the 1980s, and Exeter was in the forefront of British developments, which did not actually mean very much. To catalogue a book title then, we had to fill in a Fortran form with one letter in each square, and if the typist made a mistake, the whole form had to be rewritten. It did mean we could abandon the card catalogue and move over to microfiche production, but it wasn't until the end of the decade that subject librarians were able to catalogue books on a PC by themselves. Now, despite the difficult financial times, Malcolm UK continued to meet twice a year in the 1980s and to publish regularly, while Malcolm International also had a very successful decade, meeting in Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, Berlin, Leiden, twice in Paris and Madrid, as well as making its first foray into the Arab world by holding in 1987 a conference in Hammamet in Tunisia, which was followed shortly afterwards by meetings in Istanbul and Rabat. And Malcolm International was as sociable and friendly as Malcolm UK, and the hosts could not have been more welcoming. The 1990s were a more interesting decade as automation really began to take hold. Remarkably, the eminent American librarian David Partington foresaw some of the challenges which computers might pose for librarians as early as 1990. In an article in Mila Notes in 1990 entitled Librarians, the Hidden Minority in the State of the Art, he prophesied, I quote, "The intention of automation is not so much to improve the quality of cataloguing, but rather to reduce and eliminate the time-consuming and expensive application of intellect to the cataloguing process. I suggest," this is David Partington saying this, "I suggest that reference librarians will be downgraded to being mere clerks who are trained to connect a patron to a database. Librarianship, therefore, will be lowered further in prestige in the opinion of anyone whose profession is based on intellectual work." Quote Cyperstein. And our profession, librarianship, therefore, is causing its own demise as an intellectually respectable occupation, unquote. Another note of caution was sounded at the end of the decade by American academic Daniel Varisco in a review of my bibliography on Yemen, which was published by Clio Press in 1998. He warned that, I quote, "Published bibliographies are increasingly the dinosaurs of the post-internet modern research. There are myriad ways of finding references. Locating a specific title or author is a breeze these days. Now the major libraries are archived on the web. Librarians no doubt have fewer and fewer personal inquiries to deal with," unquote. That's from Yemen Update in 1998. However, the 1990s certainly did not seem like a negative period for me as online cataloguing and web OPACs with multiple scripts were introduced at Exeter. The World Wide Web was made available to the public in late 1991. Email became the standard means of communication. Our discussion list Lisbon Middle East dates from 1999, and optical character recognition became incorporated into Unicode. At Exeter, as elsewhere in Britain, there was more money, there were more students, and even some new buildings as universities sought wealthy donors in the Middle East. The new millennium, however, brought with it substantial and to some extent disturbing change, not only in libraries but in university administration. At the University of Exeter, Senate had been reformed in the early 1980s to reduce the power of two dominant professors, only for a caucus of junior lecturers to block many of the reforms. However, the introduction of league tables in British universities and the money which followed them brought a change of mood and intention, and the appointment of Sir Steve Smith as Vice-Chancellor of Exeter University in 2002 led quickly to the introduction of the phraseology of New Exeter and Old Exeter, which was a conscious imitation of Labour under Tony Blair. The words managerial, professional, I noted that one, and centralisation occur ominously often in Jeremy Black's History of the University in the first years of the 21st century, as the Vice-Chancellor carried a Politburo around him called the Vice-Chancellor's Executive Group, which dominated decision-making and emasculated Senate. Black saw the new structure, I quote, as an instance of a more widespread neoliberalisation across much of the world. Exeter PLC had parallels with a modern high-profile company with a strong CEO, a well-defined mission statement, a concern with brand and positioning, a strong centralised administration, an emphasis on quantification, an intolerance of underperformance, and a determination to invest in success, unquote. Meanwhile, in the library in the early noughties, subject librarianship seemed to be going from strength to strength. The Middle East collections dominated the reading room of the old library where they were housed. The Arab World Documentation Unit expanded dramatically under the leadership of Ahmed Abu Zaid. Information literacy was incorporated as a compulsory element into the foundation course for all master's students at the newly built Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. Collection development expanded as research in new subjects developed, for Example, Kurdish studies and Shiite studies, and attempts were made by many libraries, not only Exeter, to direct use of the World Wide Web by producing lists of the most important sites and URLs. I even, with the help of Ahmed Abu Zaid, produced a report called Review of User Requirements for Digitized Resources in Islamic Studies, or more colloquially, Digi-Islam, a summary of which I presented to the Melcombe International Conference in Oxford in 2008. Digi-Islam was my last publication in the field of Middle Eastern librarianship. I actually retired in 2011. And I have not been involved in any of the numerous excellent digitization projects which have so transformed our subject over the past decade, which have replaced hard copy publication as the major method of national collaboration and cooperation for Melcombe UK. However, all these activities mask the fact that the fundamental principles of subject librarianship were about to change. And the appointment of Michel Schubridge in 2006 as Director of Information Studies at Exeter was the catalyst for transforming the way in which Exeter University saw its own staff and also its staff's relationship to their users. Although never explained by management at the time, there were theoretical underpinnings to the changes imposed at Exeter, as a review of the recent literature on librarianship makes clear. Nearly all of the many user studies published in the Journal of Academic Librarianship over the past 15 years confirm the rise of self-searching and the demise of the role of the librarian as gatekeeper. In a participant observation study of young researchers in Sweden in 2008, it was found that, I quote, "The search methodology of the researchers can be characterized by trial and error. They have no planned search strategy, but start at random, experimenting both with the actual words and sources to use. Even if they are unsuccessful or fail to understand what went wrong, they never use manuals, etc. for instruction. The idea of contacting the library for help does not occur to them. They have little or no knowledge of the finer points of many information sources. The majority of the researchers seldom use the library," unquote. I think by that he means the library staff. A more recent study, published in 2017, so only a year and a half ago, confirms that bypassing library staff is not an isolated phenomenon. I quote, "When seeking help on their research projects, students turn to their professors and peers and only sometimes to librarians. Nearly every published study of help-seeking behavior reached this conclusion. So it is a universal phenomenon. In their own study of students in America, the researchers from 2017 found that, I quote, students were generally unsure or unaware of librarians' roles or purpose. This finding is interesting to consider in conjunction with the students' perception of librarians as lacking insider knowledge, as it indicates a widespread lack of awareness of librarians' work, unquote. It is not surprising that the cumulative effect of these user studies has been to cause the whole concept of the library and the librarian to be re-evaluated. Two of the more radical researchers in information science, Lyman Ross and Pongrach Senya, have looked at the library in three ways. Firstly, the library is a building, which they found had adapted quite well since it, I quote, had offered a central location, fast computer connections, free printing and comfortable chairs, unquote, and often value-added spaces such as rooms for group study, a cafe or student support services. Secondly, however, they see the library as a place where collections are housed as a less successful concept, since the distributed nature of digital content and the use of Google as the primary discovery engine have reduced the need for librarians. Indeed, the authors see the library's increasingly digital holdings as creating a paradox, whereby the more digital content is available, the more this reduces the perception of the library as a place which needs to be visited in order to use the collections. And thirdly, from the point of view of staff, they suggest that, I quote, the compelling efficiencies of scale brought by approval plans, bundled digital collections, and open access titles limit the library's ability to select titles. In effect, the universe of collectible materials is shifting, as, for example, the open access movement creates a growing corpora that is accessible outside the aegis of the library, unquote. And quoting from another article, as a result of the institutional knowledge that the staff once had of the collection, as a result, the institutional knowledge that the staff once had of the collection has diminished, and the stereotypes of the librarian as gatekeeper is now largely false, unquote. The authors suggest that the librarians will gradually lose their subject functions and will assume roles such as managing institutional repositories, running cyber infrastructure projects, and being involved with data digital conversion, data mining, geographic information systems applications, and other similar functions. This is from an article saying the library is dead, long live the library, from 2008. So that's 10 years ago, and they saw it coming. Right, I will conclude now. So this may sound both like scaremongering and the meanderings of a superannuated subject librarian, but in fact the essence of the changes foreseen by Partington as far back as 1990 and dealt with great clarity by Ross and Senya in the past decade have actually come to pass at Exeter and probably elsewhere. So many library staff there left recently and have not been replaced. For example, almost 40% of library staff left in a 6-month period in 2015, that the array of subject librarians, of whom John Sterling was so proud, are no more. Inquiries are now dealt with on a daily rota basis by whichever reference librarian is on duty that day. And although there are still substantial collections of Middle Eastern materials, 60,000 monographs in the main library and 100,000 items in the documentation unit, and over 30 academics working on the Middle East, there is no librarian with the linguistic or subject knowledge to service these users. There is no directed book selection by library staff in Middle Eastern studies, and no books are bought in Arabic script, or if they are, they cannot be properly catalogued. My former library colleagues do now indeed undertake the digital data and repository tasks outlined by Ross and Senya, rather than the more traditional ones of cataloguing, classification, collection development and reference work, and the teaching of information literacy, which were the staples of my career. To conclude, it does strike me that although one must move with the times, there's a great danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Hence the subtitle to my talk. I would argue strongly that librarians who do have subject knowledge, and almost everyone in Middle Eastern librarianship does, to go by the already quoted article by Anis Salomon in the Journal of Academic Literature on Middle Eastern Studies librarians, these specialist librarians can give great added value to the collections, provided, of course, they're able to meet their users and to persuade them the librarians can offer a useful service. The report by Laura Adams is a US report, The State of Area Studies in North America, a survey of foreign language and area studies specialists in higher education, published in 2014, warns that, I quote, we may be seeing a trend of deprofessionalization among librarians with area studies expertise more broadly, with a large retiring cohort and a relatively small number of incoming students. This warning needs to be heeded. If the experience of Exeter University Library is anything to go by, and I'm very sorry to hear about the problems that are occurring at SOAS, David has told me that UCLA did not replace him. I'm afraid it is becoming a universal trend in academic libraries. So if the experience of Exeter University Library is anything to go by, then both Melcombe UK and Melcombe International and MELA, to that purpose, need to be on their guard so that the deprofessionalization of the traditional subject librarian, so convincingly and frighteningly forecast by Ross and Cheney, does not come to pass in their own libraries and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I see quite a few common points with the keynote speech. Perhaps we can take them together at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce and invite David Hirsch, who is currently the advisor to the Muhammad bin Rashid Library in Dubai. We have his biography here, so David.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you in London. Despite the cold weather, I'm coming to you from Dubai, where it's a frigid 23 degrees. So that's cold for them. So anyway, thank you. I'd like to thank the Aga Khan Center and especially Walid Ghali for arranging for me to be here with you. This is going to be a rather personal journey of how I became a Middle East librarian and my career trajectory. When I was growing up as a kid in Philadelphia, I never in a million years expected to be a librarian, especially not a Middle East librarian. I had always liked books, but I was more interested in animals and plants, and I was hoping to become a veterinarian. I guess veterinarian and librarian, it's almost the same. Anyway, my first foreign language that I studied was Spanish, which was offered in my primary school or elementary school. What do you call it here? First form? Something like that. Anyway, in university, a little bit later on, I started out as a biology major and continued with Spanish. I was still planning to become a veterinarian. And then after my first year at university, I took my first trip overseas to Spain and Morocco. And it was there that I had my first real contact with the Arabic script and was fascinated by it. And I thought that it would be interesting to study it one day. When I went back after the summer vacation to a University of Pennsylvania in the fall, one of my neighbors in the dorms was studying Arabic and started teaching me the letters. So I then decided to start studying Arabic. Meanwhile, I was faced with severe difficulties with organic chemistry and calculus, and I decided to switch to Oriental Studies as a major. That's what they called it. It wasn't Middle Eastern Studies or Arabic Studies or Islamic Studies. It was Oriental Studies. So I started there studying Arabic and Persian and Hebrew as well as classical Armenian. And one of my professors suggested that I apply to a master's program in library science, but I scoffed at the idea. I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. But then after 2 years of Arabic, I decided to apply for a program at the Center for Arabic Studies abroad at the American University in Cairo, and I was accepted. I did well in the first year, and I was encouraged to apply for an advanced program and continue for another year. After 2 years, I was hooked on Cairo and began teaching English as a foreign language there. And after 3 years in Cairo, I applied for a short intensive Arabic program at the United Arab Emirates University in Al Ain in 1983. Now this was still fairly early in the history of the UAE, and the facilities there were rather luxurious compared to the dorms at American University in Cairo. The dorms were carpeted and air conditioned, and the food was catered by the Hilton. So yeah. So we had weekly excursions to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Sharjah, and they always put us up in 5-star hotels. So after about 2 months there, I returned to Cairo. And after 3 years in Cairo, I decided it was time to return to the real world and get a job in the U.S. So I returned to my native Philadelphia, and I worked at the local Berlitz offices as a translator, a court interpreter, and again as a teacher of English as a foreign language. One day, I received a letter from the University of Chicago advertising a new program offering 2 concurrent master's degrees, one in Middle Eastern Studies and one in library science, with the possibility of a full bursary, so I decided to apply. Why not? So I was accepted with full funding, and it was an opportunity too good to pass up, and I moved to Chicago. I took traditional library science classes in cataloging, reference service, and database searching, and I later added on government documents and the horrible required course in statistics. While at University of Chicago Library School, I took 4 part-time jobs in different sections of the University of Chicago's Regenstein Library. I worked in the Divinity section, Middle Eastern Studies, the Map Library, and Authority Control in the cataloging section. So how do I get this to work? So, which one?
The right-hand one.
Right-hand one, so I just, there we go. So this was technical services at the University of Chicago in the mid-1980s. We had to use X-Acto knives in order to correct the cards. If there was a mistake, you scraped it off. No whiteout, you just scraped off the mistake, and then we had our card catalog, and we had a filing test. You had to learn how to file, and that was quite an experience. I didn't pass the first time. So my advisor, as this was a cooperative program, Middle Eastern Studies and Library Science, I had an advisor in the library, and that was the Middle East librarian, Bruce Craig. He was a veteran Middle East librarian, and he encouraged me to add Turkish to my portfolio. So I took a year of Turkish at University of Chicago and then applied for a bursary to do an intensive Turkish studies program at the American Research Institute in Turkey in Istanbul. And after my second year in library school, Bruce Craig recommended that I do an internship at the American Institute for Yemeni Studies in Sana'a. And by this time, I was finishing up my library school coursework and was preparing for my comprehensive exams and master's thesis. And one evening, I got a mysterious call from an unknown number. David Hirsch? Yes. I've been following you. And at that point, I almost hung up the phone. But then the caller said, I'm Donald Koepp. I'm the university librarian at Princeton University. When are you coming home to Philadelphia? So I was already pretty spooked that he knew all of this about me. So I told him, okay, I'll be home over Christmas break. He said, we'd like to talk to you about a potential opening here. Can you come up to Princeton by train for the day? So I said, sure, why not? And I had already received a job offer from New York Public Library, but they weren't offering any relocation assistance, and the salary was really quite low for New York. So I visited Princeton, and shortly thereafter, they offered me a job with full relocation expenses. And I began working there in December 1986, and my second day already on the job, we had a snow day already. So things were starting well. So I was a cataloger on the Near East cataloging team, and I worked there cataloging Arabic, Hebrew, as well as some Turkish. I also had the opportunity to travel to various conferences in the U.S. and abroad, the Middle East Librarians Association, MELA in the U.S., and MELCOM, which is how I met both Arnaud and Paul, in Paris and in Tunisia. It's 1987, 1988, I believe. So in November of 1988, I was encouraged to apply for a job at UCLA, and they brought me out to Los Angeles for an interview in February 1989. The weather in Princeton was cold, below zero in Fahrenheit, and it was windy with sleet and snow. I arrived in LA where the weather was bright and sunny and about 23 centigrade, and I decided then that I could live there in California. I was offered a job, and I moved to Los Angeles in June of 1989. Now, compared to the other universities that we've heard about, UCLA is a very young university. It was initially established as a normal college or teacher's school, as a normal school or teacher's college in about, actually they're right about the centennial now. But they did not begin anything remotely related to Middle Eastern studies until the late 1950s. So anyway, this was my first position as a Middle East studies selector and as a reference librarian. We were part of a group called the Bibliographers Group, and we were a wide variety of area studies and subject specialists. Only 2 people working on English, and others working on African studies, Middle Eastern studies, Judaica, Slavic and East European studies. So there were probably about 15 different selectors for the other countries besides the United States. It's since totally flipped, and there are many more selectors working on English and U.S. materials rather than the foreign studies. So my predecessor, or my immediate predecessor, was Mr. Dunning-Wilson, and he had been a librarian there since the 1960s. And had worked very hard to build the Middle Eastern studies collections, but his true passion was the Iranian studies. And I was more interested in the Arabic collections. Also, it was a difficult time to acquire materials from Iran due to the boycott of Iran by the American government. UCLA offered many opportunities for me to study and travel in my early years there. We had a small program in Central Asian Studies at UCLA, and I was fortunate to begin studying Uzbek at an intensive summer program there. And right after the Gulf War in 1991, I traveled together with our Slavic librarian to Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Brussels, Wiesbaden, Munich, Prague, Budapest, and Vienna to visit libraries and publishers. And it was then that I became aware of diaspora studies. And I visited all kinds of different centers and organizations and started to collect materials from all of these different groups. And later, I applied for a grant from the statewide Librarians Association of the University of California to collect Middle Eastern diaspora materials formally. And I visited several cities in Europe, including the ones I mentioned earlier, and collected materials from the Arab, Iranian, Turkish, Afghan, Assyrian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, and Kurdish communities. They all had their own magazines, newspapers, and books. That trip and project was very successful, and I applied for a second grant to visit other cities in Europe. And then I applied for a third grant to travel to Australia and collect diaspora materials there. And the university administration, or the library administration, was generally supportive of these trips, especially when they were funded by outside sources. So in 1993, I applied to the Library Fellows Program, which was jointly run by the American Library Association at the U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Department of State. I took a leave of absence from UCLA for a year and worked at training catalogers. And there I worked to coax them to convert to Library of Congress from Dewey so that their collections would be shelved together. So previously, the English was in one area of the library and Arabic was in another area of the library. And the Dewey classification system in Arabic was only updated once every 10 years, I think, whereas LC was updated every week. So they eventually agreed with me, and I didn't have to work very hard. They did agree. It was a major work to get them to convert over to LC classification, but it did work out, and they're still using it even after I left. So in terms of subject headings, it's a whole other ball of wax. There is no one system of Arabic subject headings for the English-speaking world. We pretty much use Library of Congress, but in the Arabic-speaking world, they have Khazandar, Shaban Khalifa, Nasser Swaydan, the Arabic Union Catalog, and then there's a thesaurus used by the Schumann Foundation in Jordan. So I'm still waiting to see any kind of effort to unify the standards for Arabic subject headings. Maybe we'll be lucky. But even the Arabic Union Catalog is not really a union catalog. The National Library of Saudi, it's based out of Saudi Arabia, but the National Library of Saudi Arabia is not a member. So anyway, while in Cairo, I had the opportunity to attend the Sharjah and Abu Dhabi book fairs, and I became familiar with publishing in the UAE. At that time, there were a total of 4 commercial publishers, and most of the publishing was done by government agencies such as the Cultural Foundation in Abu Dhabi and the Department of Information and Culture in Sharjah. The Emirates Writers Union was also extremely active. And I should add that collecting these materials in the United States was not very common. I don't think there were, the distribution in the Gulf was never very good. I still don't think it's very good. It's definitely not centralized. So it was at that time, and to this day, it's still rare for anyone to respond to a letter. And most acquisitions from the region required at least one personal visit and sometimes more. I could tell lots of stories about searching for the person with the keys to the storage area, which is a recurring theme in Quest for Publications. In fact, I decided that when I retire, I'm going to write a book about my experiences and excuses for where the keeper of the keys is. So I'm going to call it Mawsu'at al-A'dhar lil-Bahr wal-Bar, which is the encyclopedia of excuses for land and for sea. And there's also a subtitle to that, but I'll leave that for another time. I made many good connections during this stint in the UAE and also had the opportunity to visit Oman and Bahrain, and with assistance from the information officer at the American Embassy in Abu Dhabi and the cultural affairs officers of the American embassies in Bahrain and Oman. I collected boxes and boxes of materials for UAE University and was often successful in acquiring duplicate copies for UCLA, much to their dismay. Most of the materials that I collected were not held by any other OCLC member library and consequently required original cataloging. That's a four-letter word. So I had always been taught that it was good to try and expand the wider database of available publications for our user community, but not everyone was at the same viewpoint. At UCLA, before I left, any gift of over 200 books required that the selector prepare a processing plan in conjunction with the acquisitions and cataloging departments. So they were not really wild about the idea of receiving gifts. Over the years, I received grants to collect and document government and NGO publications from Yemen with a grant from the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. I shipped back over 500 kilos of books, journals, and posters in one trip. That's the first trip, I think, was in 1985 was when I went to work there, but the first trip for acquisitions was probably in 1996. Probably some of the materials that I collected are still on catalog. And when the United States banned use of funds from academic institutions for travel to Yemen, and I was able to get a grant to travel to collect materials by Hadrami migrants in Southeast Asia. I collected materials from Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Singapore was especially interesting. There are 4 major ethnic groups there: the Chinese, Tamil Indians, Malays, and Eurasians. The National Library in Singapore generally collects in these language groups. I had read that there were several Arabic newspapers, and thank you so much. There were several Arabic newspapers and magazines published in Singapore in the early part of the last century. But when I contacted the National Library of Singapore, they were adamant that they had no such materials. I pointed out that the Arabic materials were in fact available in their catalog, but I received no further response. 2 years later, however, I was gratified to learn that the National Library Board had sponsored a conference called Rihla, exploring the Hadrami minority experience and its identity in Singapore. So, the American Institute for Maghrebi Studies also provided funding for a trip to Algeria to collect government and NGO publications. And you'll notice I've mentioned several times NGO and government publications. These are among some of the most difficult materials to collect when you're working in collection development. Commercially published Arabic publications are easy to come by, but well, in general, I won't say that's not it's not 100% rule either. But getting the government documents and NGO publications, you really have to have someone there on the ground to collect them for you, or to go there yourself. Another opportunity was to be invited by the U.S. Department of State to present on Middle Eastern and Islamic collections in U.S. libraries, or on cataloging and collection development of Arabic, Persian, or Urdu materials. 2 of the more interesting trips were a trip to West Africa, including Senegal and Mali, and a trip to Pakistan for a workshop on collecting to a group of Pakistani librarians. Both trips provided opportunities for collection development of materials not often found in U.S. libraries: Arabic and Sufi materials published in Touba, Senegal, and in Timbuktu in Mali. And I also managed to collect very specialized materials such as comics, LGBT, and Christian materials published in Pakistan. More recent acquisitions travels have included trips to Turkey to collect hard copy materials published by Syrian refugees. Let me see if I can get this to show you. All right. So, this is my library. I'll talk about that in a minute. This is the Mohammed bin Rashid Library in Dubai. And some people, it's supposed to look like an open book, but some people think it looks like the Superman logo. Okay. This is our temporary offices. And that's my office. It's my desk. I work alone in a 10-story building. Yeah, this is the other staff that we have that help me basically to receive boxes and serve me different kinds of tea. I'll talk about that too. And I also have an aquarium, and I'll mention that. Okay, so these are some of the things that I picked up when I was working in the UAE. These are all different serial publications, everything from government to all kinds of interesting things, like a magazine about date palms, another one about falconry, another one, this is from the Women's Association, and there are also some things in English. And I don't think they're held in too many libraries. There's also one specialized, it's probably held in a few libraries, it's called Huruf Arabiya, which is a magazine about Arabic calligraphy, and one above there, which is called Tashkil, which is fine arts. Okay. Then some of the other NGO publications and government things that I acquired were, this is one of my favorites, the Tarbiya Wataniya, which is civics, published in Iraq, and then UNDP publications about poverty in Syria, and then another one about poverty in Armenia. So the UNDP publications are generally not too well distributed. Okay, so these are a few other things. I'm sorry, I should have brought these up earlier. So publications from Mali, from Sheikh, from Shakhsiyat fi Madrasat al-Sheikh al-Qadim. Okay, and then these are materials published by different extremist groups in Yemen. And this is a book about the librarian of Basra, who managed to save her books from a siege in Basra during the overthrow of Saddam. Okay. Oh, this is also from Hamas in Yemen. Okay, so this I was talking about the Syrian Emigre publication. So I managed to collect over 40 different magazines and a variety of books published in Gaziantep by Syrian refugees. Okay, and then another project which I was recently started working on was about zines or fanzines in Turkey. Does anybody know what zines are? No? Okay, zines are small privately published magazines. They can be on a variety of different subject matter, from poetry, literature, ecology, the Gezi protests in Turkey in 2012, politics, feminism, punk, heavy metal music, LGBT, Kurds, etc. And they are really great material. There's no ISSN, there's no Turkish barcode, which they call bandrol. They're largely self-published, and they're either free or almost free. So here's a few examples of them. Okay, and then another area that I really have enjoyed is working with comics and manga. So actually, I did a presentation together with Daniel Lowy, sitting there in the back, at the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair a couple of years ago. So this one is a very interesting Saudi one, Hijab Girl. Khanun is from the Sudan, and the other two are from Egypt. So this is published in Saudi Arabia. I don't think she's done anything additional since then except online. But Khanun is it's currently being published in Khartoum. So anyway, I'm not anti-digital, but I think there should be some kind of a balance between print and digital. And UCLA gradually became more and more restrictive about my time away, and they became increasingly focused on digital materials. They didn't always take into account that in order to have digital collections, you often have to have print collections to digitize. So born digital materials from the Middle East do exist, but they're extremely limited. So we also, as I said, I'm not anti-digital. We did do several projects to catalog websites and also crawl many different types of websites. So after approximately 29 years of service, I retired from UCLA in late January of 2018 for about 1 week. And I was offered a job as advisor to the new Mohammed bin Rashid Library in Dubai. And I departed Los Angeles on February 1st. And you saw the picture of the library already, and you saw my office. The Mohammed bin Rashid Library promises to be one of the largest public libraries in the region, comprising 7 major divisions: general, children, young adults, maps and atlases, arts and media, rare books and manuscripts, and periodicals. So I've been there for about a year. We hope that our library will open in about a year from now. I'm at present the only full-time employee other than the dutiful Farash, or the tea boy, who brings me cappuccino, green tea, Suleimani tea, and a Saudi herb tea called Habak Ha'il, and karak tea and water. And I have a choice of room temperature or cold. And we have a CEO, a chairman of the board, and an advisory board. And I have a small aquarium in my office filled with guppies. So as we await our acquisitions budget and recruitment budget, I've been engaged with requesting gifts from different government agencies and NGO organizations, universities, associations, individual authors, primarily from the UAE and the other GCC countries. So Dr. Walid has asked me to talk about some tips. And I don't know if these will work for everyone, but they are things that have helped me. Okay, first of all, learn as many languages as you can. They come in handy in many places that you would never expect. And be creative when it comes to finances. Yeah, don't sleep. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So when I was in California, the time difference between most countries in the Middle East and the US was 10 to 12 hours. So midnight in Los Angeles was 10 a.m. to noon in most parts of the Middle East. If you can get a WhatsApp contact for anyone in an organization, they'll always guide you to the most efficient way to get what you need. So, and they don't like to send official letters, and they don't like to respond to official emails. So if you get the WhatsApp address or their WhatsApp number, you write to them, they call over to the storage room, hey, Mohammed, bring me 2 copies of this and send it to Mr. David. So, and if you go through official channels, they have to get official approval. So that's what I mean by don't sleep. You have to be up in the middle of the night when they're at their best. So, and be creative when it comes to finances. This was the best advice I ever got from my first boss at UCLA, Karen Wittenborg. We had many difficult times with difficult budget times there, and she would say, well, if you can find a way to do it yourself, then do it yourself. So I would send a lot of letters by myself instead of going through acquisitions, because acquisitions would request periodicals from Egypt, from Horasolitz in Germany. So I'd say, I'm going to write to the organization in Egypt myself. More often than not, you would get a good response. Sometimes no, they'd say, well, you have to pay for the postage. At that point, UCLA was still paying postage. Now they don't like to. Network as much as possible at conferences. Frankly, that's often more important than the actual conference, with the exception of this conference, of course. So personal contacts are key. You don't always need to deal with the big boss of any organization. Some places will require that you do, but more often than not, you can rely. You don't have to. And don't rely on e-only publications. I didn't put that there, but so many government and other non-commercial websites disappear. I'm sure many of you have come across messages which say 404 not found. So get a hard copy whenever you can. I'm sure my administration they'd be turning in their graves, the ones that are no longer with us. But yes, okay. Let's see. I have another page and a half. I'll go quickly. Okay, try to have more than one vendor or aggregator in each country that you're dealing with, and to the extent possible, make visits to the countries that you're covering. Most vendors have their standard sources, but if you make a personal visit, you'll often find things that your vendors were not aware of. Many of the societies and NGOs are run on a volunteer basis and work from 5 to 7 on alternate Thursdays. If you want to collect unique materials, that's what you'll have to do. Make as many allies as you can with the faculty and try to get them to buy into your activities. Most library administrations want nothing more than to please the faculty. If you can convince the faculty that a subject is of interest, the library will buy into it. I could talk about those at length, such as textbooks and cookbooks and comics, but anyway. And if you're not doing the ordering yourself and paying invoices yourself, make friends with the colleagues in the acquisitions department, because they will get packages like this and they're not happy. And they will get invoices like this with scribbles, and they're not happy about that either. So partner with other departments in the library. Middle East is usually a mystery to them. I partnered with the Biomedical Library to do presentations on public health in the Middle East, and with the East Asian Library to do a project on Asian Studies librarianship with our acquisitions division to do several presentations on squiggly languages in the library. That's what they call them. It's like it's in one of your languages. Take it out. So even more important perhaps, if you're not doing the cataloging yourself, do your best to engage the catalogers, especially if you have a lot of material requiring original cataloging. Acquiring materials is only half the battle. Getting them cataloged and on the shelves is quite another. Well, that's all I had prepared for today, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We have, I understand, just 5 minutes for any questions. And we have seen quite a few common threads running through these two presentations. In fact, even with the keynote speech. And what I find very interesting is that this has been looking back and bringing us to where we are now, which is very interesting. The challenges that all three have faced, and the existing condition now of the libraries vis-a-vis the administration, the faculty, etc. So may I open the floor to questions, please? Or comments, if not questions. Please.
If I may, what strikes me during your presentations, and mine also to some extent, is how important the personal element is through private initiative. You are strangers. The world of librarianship is very much cut out. It's very well organized, and you're a kind of freebooter, a kind of buccaneer in a system that is not really made for you, and you have to push at the boundaries, find your own solutions. So it's really it comes to your own personal competence and abilities. So that is what I think is very important, and it always will be important, not only in the past, but I think that in 30 years' time we will have the same kind of presentations from the younger generation. I wonder if you agree. Or
I agree, but I think we're being more and more limited by our administrations, and they don't want you to go up and try and do things yourself. Used to be creative, do what you want, just don't bother us. So. But now
I'd agree. I think probably the data is trying to do collaborative projects. It's possible. I mean, instead of the individual ones which we were able to do, I mean, Yanya's disappearing for months on end to Uzbekistan or wherever, who knows? But I think collaborative projects are probably the essence of what is going to have to take in the future, because as David said, you're controlled so tightly. You've already explained you have to do personal research in time that is your own time. You're not allowed to do it in library time, and everyone in Exeter now works in an open plan office. You can't even have an interview with a student without everyone else hearing what you're saying. Life is going to get more difficult, I think, rather than easier. I'm talking about generality of university libraries rather than perhaps the very specialist stuff, but even so, it's the trend that's coming. So keep working with your colleagues. That's why Malcolm, Mila, Malcolm International, a real chance. I mean,
networking.
That's right, networking. So leave it at that.
Would that have the shape of a kind of resistance, underground resistance movement?
Oh, Sam, is that literature is very collectible? Yes. So,
Any other comment or question? Well, if not, then we will break for lunch. And may I remind you that, in fact, the second panel will now move to the future. As it says, it's tools, challenges, and the future of the profession. So, and that starts at 1:30? Yes, 1:30. We will still start at 1:30. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for the speakers.
So, I mean, now to the second panel led by Dr. Abdurrahman Azam. May I ask the speakers to come to the stage, and Dr. Abdurrahman Azam as well.
My name is Abdurrahman Azam. I'm going to be moderating this afternoon session. Is the microphone on? Yeah. Okay? Yeah. It's really interesting that we're going to be discussing about the future of libraries. Maybe I can just give you a very quick background. About 2 or 3 years ago, while I was working in Qatar, I worked in Qatar for many years at the Qatar Foundation, and I was tasked to lead a working group that was looking to establish the Qatar National Library, which opened last year. It's under the directorship of Dr. Suhair Wastawi. And it was a really, really interesting exercise for us, because for the first time, we were trying to launch a library that had not existed before. So this is a library that completely was fresh to the digital arguments, to the whole discussion that we heard this morning. And we were asking some really tough questions. We were faced with some really interesting challenges. We have many focus groups, and a lot of the questions that came up were precisely about, why do we need libraries? Why do the young people now need libraries? Why is it that if everything is digital, we actually need to go to a library? And of course, there are some valid and very important reasons that we know why. There's a whole question about the library. Is it about collection? Is it about connection? Is it about, the whole digital argument? Equally, the biggest challenge perhaps we faced in opening the Q&L was the struggle to find young people who wanted to have a career in library. They needed to understand that the librarian's role has changed. They needed to understand that it was no longer a passive, people coming to research, that they had to be a catalyst for research. And I'm very interested because today Sarah, a colleague of mine in the Kitab project, is going to be talking about the project that we've initiated with the QNL, where really the library is trying to become a catalyst and a promoter of research using both the technology of digital technology and its collection. So there's a lot of debate, there's going to be a lot of discussion today. We're going to hear from our three speakers, but really the future of libraries is as important as it's always been. But from my brief experience, it has been so fundamentally questioned that I think sometimes we need to pause and think about the future. Our first speaker is Gregor Schwab from the University of Freie, Berlin, and he's going to be talking about Index Islamicus, the perspectives for challenges, digital age.
Thank you.
Why is the remote control? The remote is just okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My thanks to Walid for organizing and inviting the panelists. I haven't got something written for what I'm going to talk about. My talk will be an annotated slideshow, and the slides consist mainly of screenshots related to the work we are doing on Index Islamicus, and I'm going to raise questions related to maybe even the justification of the existence of a bibliography, but certainly challenges related to the digital age, technological innovations and new tools available. I will talk about data collection, data processing, and making data available to the end user. So in different steps. So if you start with what subject librarians are about, you will certainly have a synchronic perspective to show people working in the area what is available right now. You have an historical perspective, diachronic, to basically map out how a field has been developing over generations, new approaches to areas, new methodologies, and so on. And you have some quality attributes which are quite obvious, so I don't need to read them out. But each of these quality attributes has questions involved about how to achieve them and what are the pitfalls to not to achieve them. So the bibliographies in the digital age have a range of new challenges which were probably did not exist as long as bibliographies were only published in print, as was the case with Index Islamicus over at least the first 40 years of its existence. So you have new questions about data collection, data storing, the new types of material, new formats of material that have to be included in a bibliography that didn't exist beforehand, the arrangement of metadata, schema. So I will talk specifically about some of those later on. And of course, the whole questions about linking up your bibliography to the whole world of information and linking data, cross connections, interoperability with other databases, and so on. So these are all challenges that come in addition to what a bibliography used to be for the last generation of researchers. So Index Islamicus, you see a picture of the volumes that have been published since the 60s. Initially, it used to be a bibliography of the holdings of the University Library of Cambridge, and then gradually developed into a subject bibliography of the entire field. Here you see the descriptions of what the Index Islamicus is meant to be on the website of Brill, and on the left side you see examples of accessing Index Islamicus through EBSCO and ProQuest. Here a screenshot from how it looks like within EndNote, for example. Can any other reference management tool has different ways of accessing, of course always conditioned by what your institution is subscribed to. So this is not an open access bibliography, but one that requires some kind of subscription, which is already one negative point, because ideally a bibliography would be free of access for everybody at any time. So anyway, so that is already one aspect. So you have a short history of how Index Islamicus evolved since the 50s, and so all this timetable relates to the pre-database period, basically. So we have only in basically when Brill acquired Index Islamicus, they started to turn the printed volume into database material by some people in India typing the whole material, transforming the printed stuff into first OCRing it and then transforming it into databases, which in itself already involves quite an important amount of mistakes and errors which affect the library, the bibliography until today. So here an example of how the organizing the daily work has changed over the last few years only. So while the coverage of over 5,000 periodicals used to be organized by cards, everything is now organized through a Zotero library, covering all the periodicals and its coverage, responsibilities, priority levels, and so on. So each of the periodicals we have on our list of what we cover has a priority label assigned to it, and which decides how often it is indexed. And it also tells you what kind of other indexing bodies are covering the same journal, and I'm coming to it later on what that means. So as I said, we are using Zotero. Most of you, all of you will be familiar with what Zotero is, which is basically one of the free tools in order to collaborate or basically globally synchronizing databases and working in a team at the same time on a bibliography. We use it not as a bibliography, but as a in order to organize, monitor our work in progress. So we have our classification code system. You may be familiar with, certainly the librarians are familiar with the classification codes of Index Islamicus with the keywords. We have in here also data which are not even incorporated in the Index Islamicus yet. For example, we have Index Islamicus names, which contains the whole concise biographical guides compiled by Wolfgang Behn, with about 35,000 short biographical entries on scholars in Islamic studies up to the up to the end of the 20th century, more or less. So this is available for the time being as database, but for mostly financial reasons, there has not been a way to integrate it into Index Islamicus, and of course also to bring it up to date. But that is one aspect of what a bibliography should provide today, that you should be able to have a short biographical abstract for any person, whether it's a historical person or a contemporary researcher. You would like to know what they did, what they are about. So we have systematic coverage involving periodicals and publishers. So we systematically cover a number of publishers where we go through publishing catalogs on a regular basis, and as I said, over 5,000 periodicals. And then we have to be indexed is basically monographs, published volumes, edited volumes with multiple contributions, which where the table or the contents have to be indexed after the volume itself has been indexed. And yeah, we have other elements which I will explain shortly. For example, we have an option. We have introduced an option where people can apply to have a new periodical indexed in Index Islamicus. That has this online application form has been introduced a couple of years ago. And as we saw in the previous, we have one folder called periodicals requests. So periodical requests are the applications we received, and one of the symptoms of the problematic symptoms of a bibliography in the Islamic world is exactly where these new applications come from. So 99% of the applications we get for new periodicals are from Southeast Asia, South Asia, or Turkey. And of course, on the one hand, they are keen to appear on a list of periodicals surveyed in Index Islamicus. It gives them a certain surplus of value, at least in their eyes. And for that reason, they are obliged to include articles in one of the languages we cover. So because we don't cover languages like Urdu, Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, they need to include articles. So you will see some journals that historically have not been publishing in European languages, including articles in European languages, which are not always a quality attribute. So we have selection rules and criteria they have to meet in order for the periodical to be accepted. But on the other hand, it is one of the elements that contributes to the flood of new information. So one of the central aspects of the digital age is an immense increase in information or in publications related to the subject area of Islamic studies. And these new periodicals from Southeast, South Asia, and so on are an important element in this new increase of publications. So this is just an example, a screenshot of some of the latest applications we got. You see very quickly that most of them are from the regions I mentioned. So so still within the field of where we get information from, we have loads of bibliographies in sub-areas of Islamic studies published in different publications. So I've only included here some examples. And I intentionally included examples of bibliographies published in print only or at least in a non-database form. So even though we live in a digital age, lots of valuable, and I'm speaking about bibliographies monitored by scholars, academics who are experts in this sub-area. Lots of those bibliographies are still published in forms that are basically not up to the requirements of the digital age, even though the user-friendliness of those bibliographies would be much enhanced if the same bibliographies were published in database form. Anyway, we use these bibliographies as one of the supplementary resources, basically, to close gaps that are not covered by what I mentioned previously with periodicals and publishers. Then we have also a kind of an expression of the digital age. We have a multiplication of what I call manipulable institutional and global repositories. So the more famous one are academia.edu, ResearchGate, ORCID, Humanities Commons, Google Scholars can be counted as Figshare and so on. So there are loads of these repositories that can be monitored by people themselves. Not only academics, of course, but anybody can place publications, including, of course, publication related to the subject area of Index Islamicus. Now, these can be valuable places to locate publications that are not traceable otherwise. But in order to be included in a bibliography, you have to verify that they actually exist, that you have to have a second source to know that they are not fake publications. And the metadata on these repositories are horrendously poor. So even though we live in a digital age, the quality of the metadata has decreased by a huge amount. And so while obviously the digital age brings us more facilities, more opportunities to work with metadata, we are confronted with a huge amount of metadata that are basically unusable or incomplete is probably the least problematic term you can use. But if they are incomplete, they are already in a more or less acceptable shape. That's the best you can get. But many scholars put their publications on these repositories and don't bother at all about providing reliable metadata. So that's for example one way you would trace publications, recent publications about subject areas that you subscribe to research interests on academia.edu in order to trace what is being added to these repositories in these subject areas. But everything to take with a grain of salt. Huh? So then, beyond that, we have citation indexing systems and services. These are mostly not free access, so depend on institutional subscriptions. And everybody will be familiar with most of them. So we have Scopus, we have institutional, we have Primo, Web of Science, we have Internationale Bibliographie der Zeitschriften, IBZ, and so on. So these are indexing bodies which index a certain amount of publications, and with these indexing bodies we can address another very central problematic of bibliographies today, that is the reduplication of the same information in different databases. So all of these commercial indexing bodies tend to cover a similar range of periodicals, publishers, publications, and as you will find on products like Google Books or Google Scholar, there is a danger that the amount of publications included come up again and again. So it's kind of a closed corpus of texts, mostly English language-based publications, which reproduces itself several times. And the value attribute related to this reduplication is also one of the big dangers, so that actually the prominence and the visibility of publications becomes increased because they are included in those commercial indexing bodies. So one task of a bibliography is to go as much as possible against this tendency. So one of the major tasks we are trying to achieve over the last few years is to reduce labor time we need to include records or material included in these indexing bodies to integrate them in the Index Islamicus in a shorter time in order to have more time for material that actually will not figure in these big indexing bodies. So this is on the one hand language-based. Of course, we won't find Russian publications, Serbian publications, Bulgarian publications, whatever you want in those indexing bodies. So in order to have more time for these publications, we have to decrease the time in order to reproduce what already exists. So so one way of doing is this customized subject alerts in these indexing bodies, so that basically we have this whole material available. And so one of the innovations we only about 6 months ago introduced is actually a possibility to import external data into our database. Everything that was integrated in the database previously had to be added by copy-paste manually. So it took several years of pushing and fighting in order to get an import tool, which is related to a conversion tool, because you have to convert certain XML formats into others in order to enable importation. So that is one of the innovations we introduced into our database. Another source for the information would be the users. So we ask in the preface of Index Islamicus and on the website that users are invited to submit missing publications. We get about 3 or 4 per year. So it's something that doesn't seem to be very interesting for an academic to submit publications to a commercial bibliography. Maybe it would be interesting if it was freely available. But anyway, it's also a question about visibility. So the information has to be spread through social media and so on in order to raise this awareness for this possibility. So then, so one of the important aspects of the digital age is, of course, that bibliographical data, whether a subject bibliography, whether a library catalog, whether an online bookstore or a bookstore, on site, that all this book-related, publication-related information there needs to be a communication between the metadata of those different. So that's probably one of the important innovations or important additions to what was previously available, where a library catalog was totally separate from Amazon and totally separate from from an inventory list of a bookstore and so on. So several institutions have developed what they call ontologies, so basically to describe how all these entities are related to each other. Schemata of metadata in order to ensure that these different databases can communicate with each other. So the RDF, Resource Description Framework, is kind of this, the most general form, and then the Library of Congress has developed this BibFrame, and OCLC has developed schema.org, and other bodies have developed other ways to link these different data together. So you see in the case of the BibFrame structure, you have a hierarchy from the abstract to the concrete, the material. So the item is something that the specific item on the shelf, so relates to the shelf mark in a library or the barcode in a bookstore. The instance is the same publication in different formats, different as ebook and so on. And the work is the most abstract form of what any person or collective are producing in as intellectual property or product. Anyway, so one of the tasks of bibliography in the digital age is to take this into account. So you have to understand that the bibliography is part of a much wider network. And so the British Library itself had several, at some time, transformed the national bibliography into this kind of RDF framework, and you have the URL. If you are interested in seeing this from close by, just note down the URL in the top left corner, where you will find some interesting material kind of describing how what used to be a library catalog has to be integrated in a more complex metadata scheme in order to communicate with new audiences. So the library catalog for the general public, for academic researchers, for book trade, schools, and so on. And so the one of the big problems is that there's a proliferation, so multiple initiatives like Library of Congress, British Library, other big bodies, and efforts to find a common vocabulary, to find compatibility is still in a very unstable phase right now. So we still don't have kind of a universal standard, and may never have one. But that's certainly a problem. That if you want to develop a bibliography that works within this framework, whom are you going to follow? So is it a certain? It's always a certain risk that you ride the wrong horse. You know, so that 5 years later you actually see that you have chosen the losing option.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So that is just the XML structure of this same thing. For so I just show you in our database a sample record to see. So we have introduced ISNI, authority control. So Index Islamicus over 50 years had no authority control. It is difficult to believe, but it's true. So one of the big problems with the transferring the printed books into database was, as I said, a contamination of metadata. A bibliography with contaminated metadata is highly problematic. In order to clean up this mess, you need authority control on all levels. So for name versions, so people using Index Islamicus will know that if you search for a certain name version, you will only find publications related to that name version and all. So authority control is one way, or is one solution to get rid of this. So when people are looking for a publication of one person that appears with different name versions, will still find everything. But this has still not been integrated in the publicly available Index Islamicus, so that's still only available for us, but in the future will bear fruits for the end user. So that applies not only for researchers, but for historical figures. So ISNI, if you want to use ISNI, and I can give you an example. The next page. Yeah. So an ISNI record on the right-hand side. So Adud EG, for example, will look like the entry on the right-hand side. So you will have one 16-digit number related to all the name versions as they appear in different scripts, in different languages, in different transliteration systems, and so on. And the same applies to ORCID. ORCID is not monitored by institutions, but by individuals. But they are able to communicate. So ISNI and ORCID are both under the auspices of OCLC, and we are still many publishers are now asking researchers, academics, scholars to have an ORCID before they are able to publish. And this is one way that would actually facilitate authority control and also completeness of publications of a certain individual for a bibliography if we can integrate these elements into the bibliography. So these are example people from this room. I don't know whether you recognize probably your name, but I don't know whether you recognize your ISNI or VIAF or whatever. So anyway, these elements, these authority control elements are incredibly important for the whole linked data element in order to communicate between different databases, these numbers are just as important as they are for the cleanness of metadata in one database. And so that's the last slide. The last slide just shows you a multitude of Brill products. So the authority control and other elements of URIs will facilitate the communication between these products. So now when you use Index Islamicus and you want to have publications related to a specific historic figure, you will find only those related to a specific name versions. Now with the ISNI and so on, you will find really everything that has been included in the database related to different name versions of that subject, but it will also eventually enable to find everything else. So for example, if you are looking for publications about Adud al-Din EG, and you would at the same time know what has Brockelmann about manuscripts of his works, that will be possible once this authority control has been implemented across all these products. So that is not available yet, but is, in my view, just one example of what the advantage of linked data will provide, that the communication between products that are totally isolated from each other now will be integrated and communicating with each other. Yeah, that's about what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Our second speaker is the acquisitions librarian here in the Aga Khan, Wasim Farouk, and he'll be talking about the state of Middle East librarianship in the United Kingdom.
Hello, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present here. This is a paper which this is the presentation which I previously presented at the MELA conference in last year, 2018. And this is very much the same, but I have made some changes slightly for this presentation. So since the past 6 years, the role of Middle East Studies librarian at various universities, along with other subject librarians, have been affected by an overall restructuring. The library management structures, the overall restructuring of the management structures. These changes have affected the Middle East librarians in various ways. Some have decided to continue and adapt. So some librarians have decided to adapt and continue at the same library. Some felt that they could not identify with the new roles and that was selected for them, and decided to move elsewhere. So despite the new subject area being starkly different from their previous roles, others have resigned from their libraries, hoping to find another Middle Eastern librarian role elsewhere. So in this presentation, I will be focusing on 3 libraries. So obviously, I'm not going to be talking about the Middle Eastern collections in the whole of UK. So I'll be focusing on 3 libraries that have been affected by this change, by the restructuring, to illustrate the impact it has had on the collection development. I will show the number of universities offering Middle East Studies courses or Islamic Studies, and whether they have a subject specialist librarian. And then we may well muse whether a subject specialist librarian is really needed, and how this trend could impact the future of other Middle East or Islamic Studies departments. So for this presentation, I've also focused on only on higher education institutes. So I'm not focused on smaller education providers. So I've only looked at like universities that hold Middle East related material. So in terms of restructuring, so in 2012, University of Manchester's library, a designated national research library, decided to replace their traditional subject librarians with functional teams. This also affected the position of the Middle East librarian there. So the structures. Okay, so this is the sort of like a snapshot of the structure. Above was the previous subject-based support structure at the University of Manchester, more specifically, and then at the bottom is the new streamlined functional support structure. So the restructuring was a response, they say, to the changing information environment and the shift of emphasis from collections to users. So those who supported the restructuring cited that the functional team structure promoted a flat management structure and a shift towards self-managed teams for flexibility and adaptability to change. Some argued that the functional teams are cost-effective, consistent, and measurable. Furthermore, as far back as the 70s and 90s, Dickens, Heseltine, and others predicted that subject librarianship would become irrelevant as the focus shifted from contributing subject knowledge to teaching skills and competencies. And this is, we can see more and more in terms of the restrictions, and also has been mentioned previously. So the restructuring process, well, I'm only starting from 2012 and from University of Manchester. Well, obviously, in the past there have been other restructuring, but not in such a degree that may have in fact impacted the Middle Eastern librarianship, Middle East librarian. So I'm only trying to focus on the past few years, and obviously this has started a trend in other libraries. So the restructuring at Manchester was not the result of cutbacks. So in Manchester, University of Manchester identified that the reasons for restructuring was to align with the university's overall teaching, learning and research strategies. It was not due to financial cuts, or on the contrary, it was to invest further in staff training and development. The library had, in fact, secured a successful bid for additional funding for this purpose. So University of Leeds also cited that the restriction was not due to financial cuts, but they were actually following the trend set by Manchester. Moreover, the librarian who initiated the Manchester restriction had moved from Leeds to instigate the same. University of Exeter's decision for this restructuring was unclear. However, Paul Octoloni, who's here, who had served as a librarian for about 40 years, commented in the context of our correspondence on Exeter that many academic libraries have abolished subject librarian teams because of the perceived reduction in importance of the librarian as a source of information. So the librarian seems to be no longer a source of information, it seems. So due to these restructuring, there has been an impact on the level of acquisitions and collection development. So University of Manchester, there has been an obvious reduction in the number of requests from the academics. So before they had a dedicated librarian actively collecting material on the Middle East and current research from around the area, and not only in Western language scripts, but more importantly from the local vernacular scripts. Well, obviously, since the restructuring, so the number of obviously they have no longer been actively acquiring, but the acquisitions have been based on requests from the academic departments. So in the recent past, there had been a good number of requests for Persian material as well. Despite even after the restructuring, they had increased acquisitions of Persian material, and that was only due to an academic that was particularly active there. But when he moved on to another university, this also ended. So at the University of Leeds, so between 2002 and 2014, they were relying on academics to suggest publications for acquisition, and they also had an Arabic cataloger. But they also went through restructuring, and since 2014, they've also been relying on academics for their acquisitions. So there's no proactive collection development, and the library purchases content on demand. Arabic cataloging is outsourced as and when needed. At the University of Exeter, also there seems to be no acquisition of in Middle Eastern languages. However, the library has been reluctantly accepting donations in Middle Eastern languages. These were catalogued by the retired past librarian Paul Octoloni voluntarily. He reported in October that about 20 books were catalogued last year. So what does the future hold? I mean, this is a lot of some radical restructuring going on. So in terms of research, how is the research on the area of the Middle East going to go forward? So what is the and also more importantly, what does the future hold for the Middle East specialist? There's there is no shortage of courses available on Middle Eastern studies. I mean, there are plenty of universities offering courses on Middle Eastern studies, and there seems to be a growing trend of universities. So it doesn't mean that just because because of the recent times there has been a slump in terms of universities offering Middle Eastern studies courses. There has actually been quite an increase. So they rely on offering Middle Eastern. So to gauge this, I used the UCAS website to search for courses offered. So UCAS website is the universities and colleges admissions service. It's a UK-based organization whose main role is to manage the application process for British universities. So obviously, it's I think most of the courses offered that are on UCAS, they're primarily the taught courses, and the courses are primarily undergraduate courses, and there are some postgraduate courses as well visible there. So searching for Middle Eastern studies, courses on the UCAS website last year, I managed to. There were 22 universities came up that offered Middle Eastern studies courses, and amongst them or between them, the number of courses that were offered were 228. So 228 courses on the Middle East were offered by 22 institutes. and the number is growing. However, of these 22 universities, currently only 3 of these 22 universities have a Middle East subject specialist, as far as I could see on this list. So I mean, that goes to show what was there before. I mean, there were plenty of universities offering Middle Eastern Studies courses, and there were quite a few, plenty of Middle Eastern Studies specialists as well in the libraries. However, now the number is currently the 3 that I could only identify. Perhaps there could be some more. And that's the ones that currently have Middle Eastern Studies librarians, SOAS, University of Oxford and Cambridge. And in the past, since 2012, from University of Manchester, Exeter and Leeds, and most recently the librarian representing the Middle Eastern Studies courses also moved on from University of Durham. So I did try to communicate with University of Durham. I'm not sure about their intentions of replacing the Middle Eastern subject librarian. But I mean, the interesting part is that these changes did not only affect the Middle Eastern Studies languages; it also affected other subject areas as well as other languages. And when I added Islamic Studies to the search with Middle Eastern Studies, the total number of institutes was 31, and then that also increased the number of courses that were offered between the lot was 325. So the librarians, what can we do in terms of how to raise our profile, and how can we go about trying to emphasize the value that the Middle Eastern specialists can bring to the university? I'm not sure about these universities. I mean, they're the ones that are letting go of their Middle Eastern specialists or the other subject specialists. And they may, how they can justify that they can, in terms of their research, how can they give, how can they bring about good output of research without having current resources from the countries that are being studied. So I did communicate with some librarians, and these were some suggestions that were given, that in terms of trying to the librarians will need to be proactive and try to raise their profile and develop themselves in line with the changing nature of information. They need to promote and demonstrate the value of area and language specialists and the impact it will have to promote the university and raise its research profile. I'm sure you'll agree with me that the Middle East subject specialists are highly valuable and indispensable. Moreover, they will adapt, they will add depth to the information needs of patrons, and will overall certainly raise the profile and rank of the university. So that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Wasim. Final speaker is Dr. Sarah Bonsama. Sarah is the Professor of Cultural History at Aga Khan University, and she's the Principal Investigator of the Kitab Project. And she'll be talking about studying the Arabic tradition at a distance. Good.
Thank you. Right. So I see. So it goes down. Is that right?
Sideways.
Sideways.
So,
Okay. How do I do this? Sorry.
I think it's this one.
No? This one. Good. Okay. Thank you. Perfect. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I've come as, I guess, the non-library sciences member of the panels, and as an academic who's found herself rather late in her career entering into the field of what is, I think, traditionally more librarians' areas of expertise. And simultaneously, I was trained, I should say, very traditionally. So I was the library I studied at Harvard and Widener Library, and specifically the Gibb Room, was my home, and where I studied language and had 3 people in a class with Wolfhard Heinrichs, and had the benefits of that old system of learning. So I share some very mixed feelings, about the movement towards the digital, but I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there's larger forces at work in which we are finding ourselves and navigating, sometimes with success and sometimes with less success. So I very much hope that there'll be some time, if not during this panel, but afterwards, to have conversation and to take input from you. Good. So I'm here to present the Kitab project, and I'll come to in a minute why I think this is most relevant for you. But let me first introduce the Kitab project more generally. So the word Kitab is the Arabic word for book, as we all know. And for the project that I run, it stands for Knowledge, Information Technology, and the Arabic Book. And we've grown out of an initiative begun here in 2013 to study reuse of texts across whatever sources we can acquire in digital machine-readable format. So this comes out of the tradition as a whole, I should say the historic tradition. We're working on the tradition from about 700 till 1500. And it's some of the core features of Arabic are what first excited us and turned us on to the possibility of applying what has essentially been developed in other fields like, I guess, anti-plagiarism software, to the entirety of the Arabic tradition. So this is that there's extensive repetition between historical works. We know this as historians. This is measurable now with algorithms and with specific technologies that we're developing. And also that Arabic has patterns that we can detect at a larger distance for this reuse. So reuse is the term that we use, by which we don't mean specifically copying from one text to another. We don't have a particular schematic assumption when we start the conversation. What we're interested really is finding common patterns of words. And we use, I can go into more detail, but we use a method that was developed by my partner, David Smith, that involves shingling. So we look at 5 n-grams repeated 5 times between books, and I'll come to the data in a minute. But this is the core interest began with a research question. That's what I sort of want to start with. The project involves a lot of people. Kevin's in the room in the back, Abdurrahman's in the room, and a lot of partners and a lot of different types of expertise. And I think this is obviously, a key aspect of working in the digital era is that, no single set of skills is ever sufficient. And right now, the major, sort of partners are Leipzig University and the University of Maryland. The Open ITI project, I'll come to in a minute, is co-run by me, Matt Miller at the University of Maryland, and Maxim Romanov, who many of you may know besides me. We've had a lot of different, funding, although very quickly and recently. So we started with a volunteer group, which is the picture here from 2014, I believe. And these were volunteers supplied by the university. We have Malik Merchant in the far left, in the back, and then Ahmed Saki towards in the close on the left. And then that's Maxim Romanov and Sohail Merchant, another volunteer. So everyone was volunteering their time. We met every Sunday for 4 years, and also virtually, and had endless calls, as well. We've had funding from the British Academy. Now we have a European Research Council funding. We have now funding from the Qatar National Library. And we've had different forms of financial and other serious contributions from Harvard, Northeastern, Vienna, and Leiden universities. The ERC grant, I'm talking about just workflows now, funds, well, this is the actual scheme, it's the Consolidator grant, and it's in the social science and humanities. And it funds for $2 million for a team of 5 historians to work, based on 5 regions for historians to work over 5 years. And these are the regions that we're working on, so the Islamic West, the Islamic East, these are convenient terms we've adopted to organize ourselves as historians, as well as Egypt, Iraq, and then Syria. We have Arabia split for lack of a more convenient solution. And the questions that we're seeking to answer about text reuse specifically deal with how authors worked, how ways of copying resulted in new forms, and how narratives were adapted and changed. So the data that we're collecting on reuse is meant to feed into these larger historical questions that, in my view, really are fundamental about how groups negotiated and formed their memories. So we take very much a book history approach, we could say, using the data that we have to then ask this larger question that affects society and culture. Just an example here of some of the data that we have. Between two books, you can see a relationship running across the x-axis in the bottom and the x-axis here, and the alignment of our data where there's an overlap of the way the shingling works. This is up to 100 words, connected between two works. It's Tabari in the 10th century and Misway in the 11th. And I'm fond of pointing out that the interesting bit is the white, where there's not a common, where there's not reuse. And reading the books, as you're alerted to do when you see the white, you discover it's material relating to pre-Islamic Iran that does not exist in Tabari's text, but does exist in Misway's. So the SIRA is the other project and a research focus. I'll talk about the corpus in a minute. That is about building a corpus of Ibn Ishaq materials. And this, we're using, the basic starting point is Kevin Jakes in the back. Is here. Kevin, can you raise your hand for just a second? Kevin spent 10 years working, digitally, but also in an analog sort of fashion, collecting together materials across sources that he had from Maktabat al-Shamala and other sources, I believe, that are witnesses to the Sira of Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq's text, many of you will know, does not survive, and it's an independent recension, but is actually scattered. It's a dispersed text. So it's a rather unusual feature of the Arabic tradition to have, if you think, that the major prophet, the biography of the prophet, survives, not as a single biography, but instead a scattered work. So we're using Kevin's data and working on the algorithms to try to get a much, to pull together evidence across the corpus of what we have as witnesses to the Sira. We're building a scalable research platform for the QNL, and this is, I think, important to all of us here in the sense that we're building a reading environment that will be usable for reading books online, and we'll have a version of it by the end of this year online. And the other aspect of this is that the QNL wants us to now move beyond our own research questions and to try to engage public, a public audience. So we're having to think much more about public engagement and outreach. So these are all aspects that we're working on with QNL. Right, so this is where it becomes more interesting, I think, for most of you in the room. And maybe the research questions are interesting, but it's just where I think the meat of this presentation should really lie. There's three then major workflows. There's the corpus that we're working on. And in thinking about, the idea of what a corpus is, this is a major challenge. So what do we mean? What do we mean by the collection that we want to curate online? There's data, and this is the text reuse data, but it's also, of course, the book data, the text data and the metadata. It's other forms of data too, for example, the algorithms that we're using to analyze texts. It's the data that will involve the visualization, data visualization, and all of this is available online in open access. We have different licenses we're using, but for software development, we're using MIT, for example. And then the fourth workflow, concretely, is the researchers and public engagement. So corpus. So this has not been released yet. We haven't made this public, but at some point we will. This is Power BI report that we are using internally to track the corpus. And so we have all of the book data that we've scraped, and this is really the work of Maxim Romanov, chiefly. It's pulled in GitHub. And then we have collected, different data. He's assigned, I'll come to that in a minute, but he's assigned URIs to all of the books, to all the files, I should say, which include all the versions. And then we can see that we have 1.46 billion words total on GitHub now, numbering 7,128 books by 1,857 authors. If we want to look at it a bit differently and say we only are interested in unique versions of files, and this is a key metadata problem. This is, what is a version? So I've written a little bit about this to say that, for example, the Muwatta, if you look up the title, the Muwatta of Malik, you find different versions, supposedly, of the Muwatta, but when you look closely at them, they really aren't very similar at all. So why do we, but we're stuck in a way with this title and this issue. So we can be part of the problem, but we also part of the solution, maybe in acknowledging and finding this. So we have this number of unique titles, and then this number of books for the period that we're meant to be working on, really the historical tradition up to 1500. Actually, 911 with Suyuti, we've extended the period slightly because it seemed sort of mean not to include Suyuti since he's so prolific. I'm very fond of saying that it's very different to work with a small tradition versus a large tradition, as Arabic is. And if here, just by point of comparison, if you think of Tabari's history or his tafsir, Tabari's tafsir is in our collection is 2.8 million words. And if you compare that to the entire Platonic corpus in Perseus, there's almost no comparison. All of the Perseus Digital Library, so the Perseus Digital Library, which is Greek and Latin works collected over the last 30 years and led by our major partner, Greg Crane. There's, I think, 13 million words for Latin and 12 million for Greek, and that's also multiple versions. So 25 million words for Perseus, and versus Arabic, where we're starting with now, as I said, almost 1.5 billion. So the way you study this and the problems that it presents are enormous and different. And books got bigger over time. It's just another sort of point. So we have, for the reuse, the story of reuse is very much a story of the way in which reuse contributed to the size and the diversity of the tradition as well, the fluidity of what a book was historically. There's a number of problems with this corpus, and this is really, I think, the issue that we've been noticing is that, not only do we have gaps in what's available in machine-readable format, but we have, with what we do have, we have a very small number of works contributing to a very large percentage of the size of the tradition. So a key aspect of what we're doing in the early years of this project is really trying to analyze the corpus as a whole to understand what we have and what we don't have. And this issue of size, I'm fond of flagging up because I think, as a historian working with actual, books, we have a better sense when you touch a book about what you're talking about. But as soon as you're online, it becomes quite abstract. On the other hand, you have suddenly, I think, a way of quantifying things that you didn't have before. So I don't think I'd ever tried to compare in my head the size of a monograph to the size of Tabari or thought in those terms. And so word counts actually, I think, can be rather interesting. The corpus is all available now on GitHub, and you can see, the ways you can click and you can read any of the books. If you have a reader, such as EditPad Pro, which is what we're using to do markdown annotation for the corpus. So this was developed again by Maxime, and it's a very lightweight system to try to get coding in. It's convertible. We're working right now in conversion to TI-XML. But the benefit of it is then we can use this information in a reader, for the structure of a text. We can also use it for our data visualization. So a key funding, one of the key things we're funding right now is annotation by Markdown from subcontractors. And the ERC team, which actually starts on Monday, the postdocs, will be doing quite a lot of Markdown annotation. So another just major workflow then is OCR. And it's been mentioned a few times already today, OCR. Of course, for Arabic script, OCR has been a major challenge. And I never expected to be working so much with metadata and sort of the field of book history as I have now. And I certainly never expected to do training data for OCR. but I have spent quite a lot of time doing training data for OCR. We worked with Ben Kiesling, who's at Leipzig University, and the output or the effect of our OCR was much better than we ever expected. And so on the back of that, we've been working with Harvard since 2017 to create an online app, which is just now, this month, being released. And it entails the ability to post-correct training data, to create training data for OCR, and then also to correct it, and then to have OCR outputs. And it's IIIF compliant. It is working right now. We've done pilots. I don't think it's there. No, we did a pilot for JSTOR in which we took Al-Abhath, the journal, and did a study. We're releasing the results of the study. And it's been verified independently, the success of the OCR solution, and it was using Corpus Builder that we did the pilot. So the accuracy rates, you wouldn't create a critical edition straight out of this, but if we're, again, thinking about creating an online body of material, it's important to have, some version, I think, up of these book files, and, the rates of, with training data and 1,000 lines training data per typeface, we're achieving between 97.5% and 99% accuracy rates with OCR. So we're taking the position that this is an important addition, especially if anyone like us is doing the kind of research that doesn't require creating a critical edition, but instead requires analyzing text to scale. Of course, you can then use this data then to create editions as well, which is another point. Persian as well. Matt Miller has used the OCR Corpus Builder and application on Persian and run pilots on this as well. And we've done it for Syriac, and we'll be starting one for Urdu shortly. We're not doing handwritten OCR right now, but it's in our sort of picture. We're in the very last minutes of a major funding application that was invited, and would probably greatly increase our ability to work with partners on doing OCR. So that's within the next couple months, we'll know. There's challenges to OCR. Here's just some, these are Matt's, I should say, these are Matt's slides. But they give you a sense of some of the types of errors. Yes, so Hamzas and vowels and Arabic, Persian books with Arabic and Arabic books with Persian. And you can see the ligatures that pose problems as well. For Arabic, Hamza is by far the biggest problem. Also spacing, spacing is a massive problem for OCR. Skewed lines. This is all in our very long OCR report. The other, I'm talking about sort of general workflows. So corpus, then data. I'll breeze through this, but just to give you a sense. So we're collecting this corpus, just to reiterate again, because we want to do research on it as historians, and we want to study patterns of reuse across time, what it means to think of a book as a category, what was a book as such, and this, of course, feeds into bigger questions or other questions. If you want to talk about what an author is, as Foucault said, you have to think of what do you mean by the work, and so these issues of creativity and authorship and works are very much part of it. So. Our text reuse data sets right now, if we took every work in our corpus and we ran it against every other work, just to see what would happen, and we generated 1 million files, and each file contains, this sort of information, which is the alignments of common passages between two different works, and also the location information, which we use then for data visualization. And of those 1 million files, this is just an example of what the data looks like up close if you to come down and read, and we use Smith-Waterman. It's just an algorithm that measures edit distance between the two texts, so we can quantify and say how precise is the alignment between two passages. And we're training now, and this is Kevin just nodding his head, we're training now the algorithm to improve, and specifically one of the challenges we're facing on the algorithmic side is how to deal with isnads, because you get a lot of false information, false positives, let's say, of relationships between works because names, are so common and so often repeated. So When you chunk up a text, you get, for example, that this book is 114% related to this book, which sort of defies reason. I mean, in a sense it is, in the way the computer thinks that we need to train it to think differently, in terms of what it records as meaningful. So we're evaluating. But to say, of those million files, most of the reuse is insignificant. It's, a string of names and another string of names and one record, and that's it. So you wouldn't want to make any sort of schematic or other sort of statistically significant conclusion. But what we're finding is that most books in the corpus have a relationship of some significance to another work. So it's very uncommon, let's say, put another way, that you find an independent work that has no other relationship to another work in the Arabic tradition. So this sort of declining line, would suggest that, in terms of the total files that are in our records. Likewise, we're finding in our data that, the biggest books are, no surprise, the biggest reusers. And this is just the list of the numbers, so we have, for example, the words matched between Ibn Asakir's History of Damascus, History of the City of Damascus, is the largest book in our corpus, and it's also the largest reuser, in the corpus, or one of the largest, actually. The Al-Aini is larger in terms of his overlap with Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's book. This then allows us, as I said, to ask questions about what is a version, for example. There's questions you can ask. So, for example, here's the Muwatta, and this isn't one, I blogged on this some months ago, but you can see that those sort of bales of wheat, that are in the middle, are rearrangements of the text, and they have the same, in the metadata, they would have the same name, the Malik and the Muwatta. Of course, historians have known for a long time that there's different transmitters of the Muwatta. They've known that there's different witnesses to the Muwatta, but being able to actually describe this as in functionally what's happening in these different versions, I think has been difficult. But the data visualizations should help people do this with more detail. And Maribel Fierro just commented yesterday on this point on our website. Questions about what is a book. Ibn Hisham's, I think, of version or text would present a good case and example. What is the book of, what do we think, is the text of Ibn Ishaq's text? What is the book here we're talking about? Just an example of some of the Sira data, in terms of reuse. And the bigger picture. So what are we doing? So we're building, we think, a corpus for international impact. We're probably the first project to claim to study the entirety of the Arabic tradition digitally, and we're interested in the DNA history, the DNA structure and the history. And ultimately what we want to do is we really want to create a public history and platform from debate. There's this expression that's sometimes used for social innovation about intelligence design. And I think that this is where we have quite a lot in common in people working in library sciences, is that the next challenge of the next 20 years is about this. It's really about reaching new people, creating opportunities for collaboration and for thought, and designing some sort of intelligence, in a way that also widens participation. So the future, the virtual reading room that I've mentioned with Qatar. So my point on widening participation, would be with this picture. My guess is that by the end of this year, we will have a total pipeline. It will not be articulated fully, but we will have worked out the architecture for it that goes from a print book that is sitting on a shelf to a machine-readable file that will be read online at on the reader developed through Qatar. The next step will be, of course, for us to import, since everything's being done at open access, will be to take it into the Open ITI, and so that into the common repository for the whole field apart from the Qatar National Library's setting, so that all projects everywhere can contribute their data, and then we can do the OCR, other people can we can participate in OCR, and then have a common repository of text. So the data structure is a key challenge for us, and we're aware of that. there's a way in which the different technologies that we're using, which this proposal I mentioned, has like 3 pages of different technologies that are contributing to this pipeline. The ways in which they interact, are really challenging. But in a way, Arabic is a beneficiary. So we're working with, as I mentioned, Greg Crane, and in Germany, they've had a much longer gestation cycle for this kind of technological development and the German book history side. And so in terms of, different systems and technologies and URN systems, et cetera, they have a lot more conflict, actually, internally, I think, than we probably do on the machine reader, working in German book history. Working in Arabic, it seems more possible to create a system, that can be articulated if collaboration is achieved, and the technology is just moving so fast. I think we have a benefit of coming in late, but also if we're smart, working together to create a system that makes sense for everyone. So this is just the virtual reading room that's being developed off of the Perseus Digital Library's work with what's called SCAPE. It's online now and was launched in 2018. Just what it looks like in Greek, which is not helpful to you at all, but you have to imagine it a bit in Arabic and Persian. And this is the architecture that sits behind SCAPE, and then that sits behind the virtual reading room that we'll have for the QNL, and then eventually for the Open ITI. The longer mission then is to create digital editions of works. And this is, I think, Kevin will be a pioneer in this work, we hope, and the QNL as well, because the QNL is very supportive of the creation of online digital editions. So imagining that instead of having a critical apparatus that sits at the bottom of the work, we should have this linked data through the different witnesses to the text. We can do this through the versions that we have now, but we also would hope to be able to use images and find ways to work with images. So this is a point that we've been exploring with the Leipzig computer scientists already. To do this, then we will be able to study books and their histories. So what part of this presentation? And ultimately, I think we'll also be producing new teaching resources. This is a print version, but of course, the online dimension of what we can do is really important. So I think, to sum up a bit, we're at a moment where there's, I think, and I feel to be honest, a great nostalgia for the days of sitting in the Gibb reading room. But I also think, wow, it would have been so much easier to learn Arabic if there had been some mechanism for knowing the words I was going to see a lot versus the words I was going to see once and never again, for example. So these word frequency reports that we have, can be used, helpfully to try to curate the learning experience of users online. And similarly, I have children, and my children learn online using all sorts of tools that, I'm sure others do as well. That you can very quickly improve vocabulary, through testing, apps. So I imagine very much that some of this work that can be built out of the textual corpus and out of our knowledge about what, words are common and repeated, will also improve the way in which Arabic can be taught. So I still think people should read 100 books to go back, or whatever the number was, or 30, I think it was 30 novels, to finish. I personally benefited from that method, but maybe they'll be doing it differently. Maybe they'll be doing it over dispersed kind of learning. They will be doing it at the ACO, the Arabic Collections Online, presented at this conference in Amsterdam. And one of the points that, that one of the project organizers said was that they were surprised because when they launched, they thought that people would be using on the computer, they assumed. And they also assumed that Arabic Collections Online would be very much accessed in Europe and North America. And they found that actually the largest points of access were on phones, and that it was occurring in the Middle East. So the, it's a different world, and I think it's, it's quite exciting and interesting for that. And I think, perhaps we have to just be a bit creative in how we try to imagine that world as we go forward. Thank you.
Can I ask Mike, Greg, do you want to join us? Yes, so we have about 5-10 minutes for questions.
two questions to Gregor. Gregor, when you say use we, does it mean Free University or does it mean Index Islamicus? Whenever you were using the word we are doing that, we are cataloging that. And the second question is, there was a slide where 16 different variations of one name appeared. Was it generated by the computer, or how it came to the list of 16 variations of a single name?
Well, when I was speaking of we, I referred to the team members compiling data for Index Islamicus. So it's nothing to do with Berlin.
Okay.
My affiliation with Berlin has expired.
So you work for Index Islamicus?
Right now, yeah.
Okay.
I also work for myself, but yes, one part of my work is for Index Islamicus.
Mm-hmm.
The other question is that the library is affiliated with ISNI. I mean, the main contributors are the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the British Library, and many national libraries and other libraries. If you go to ISNI, you will normally have a list of contributors for the list. So it's mostly based on, so the main bunch was first imported from VIAF, so which was the American LC authority control, which is much more contaminated than ISNI, even though ISNI has a lot of duplications as well. So it is in need of disambiguification as well. But it is based on library catalogs in the main.
So if I understand you correctly, so for example, Library of Congress would have 5 different variations of a name, and the Bibliothèque Nationale would have 5 different names, and you are accumulating them all together that was available.
Yeah,
so it's an accumulation of different sources.
Yeah. So it concerns script. It concerns different ways of disambiguifying names, like with the date of birth or with a middle name or this kind of thing. So all these different ways have been integrated in one list and associated to the same 16-digit number.
One last question. You said you were also incorporating sources which also included conferences. So you used a word that there were news groups that you were incorporating to expand your bibliography, the index of that you are developing. But conferences may not result in a publication as we define it. It would remain a gray literature if it's just a conference paper. So don't you think that will just bring additional work?
I mean, you can include blogs, you can include whatever is floating online, but well, you have several problems. First of all, it is a question of men and woman power. So how many people are actually doing this work? You know, one person can do a certain number of records per day if they are working full-time, and most of them are not working full-time. And on the other hand, you need competence. So if it is about comprehensiveness, so you want basically include everything that has been published in one way or another, whether by academics or not, about a certain subject, then yeah, you will include lots of rubbish.
Unfortunately, it will not remain customized subject alerts. It will become a wish list. You were talking about this point under the customized subject alerts.
Yes,
and then
but if
you are subscribing to 20 conferences on Middle East and take WOCMES for example, so there will be 5,000 entries.
No, these alerts are always proofread first. So if I get, for example, a subject alert from Scopus, I will have at least 50% related to medicine and pharmacology, as the pharmaceutical industry. So all this kind of stuff doesn't interest us at all. So once this list has been read through, it is reduced to about 5% of what is initially there. Yeah. If we included everything related to kind of, depression symptoms upon nurses in a hospital in Malaysia and this kind of stuff, then so Index Islamicus would explode, implode, lose its identity, become useless, valueless. So if we were the national library of all majority Muslim countries, it would require some major funding from Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Dubai and whatever, and a team of about 350 people. Yeah.
Two short questions. One for Wasim. You didn't mention Birmingham University. Don't they have a Middle East librarian?
I'm not too sure, but as far as I know, they don't have them. They used to have them quite a number of years ago.
Okay, and then a question for Sarah. You mentioned that most of the accesses for the Arabic collection of the online are from the Middle East. What do you think that's because of? The quality of the collections in Arab libraries as opposed to U.S. libraries? Because it's mostly from U.S. collections, or the access to the materials in the libraries?
I guess my assumption, my first assumption when I saw that was I thought of our own students. I thought of our students, who are, some are from the Middle East, some aren't, but,
right.
And I thought that they're reading, all sorts of classical works. They're curious, they're commuting. It's idle reading. It's not research reading, and that on a phone, I think. I think that's something else. Yeah.
Sorry. I have a question for Sarah Savant. How do you select your material? Do you select critical editions or anything you can lay your hands on? But I remember that when I was a PhD student, I remember this website, Al-Warraq. It contained a huge amount of text, but it was completely unclear where they found it or
which edition.
Which edition, if it was based on any edition at all.
Yeah.
So what do you do in these cases?
So at first I should say, so Maxime has vacuumed the internet. Is the best way to put it. It's a lot of text, and the metadata is very sketchy on some of them, and not verified. That's the first reaction when you look at this stuff and you start working at it. Your second reaction is, okay, and it took a few years for this to settle in, was, right, first of all, when we've compared the works to printed versions as we've been doing Markdown, I found mistakes in the Leiden edition of Tabari because the pages were reversed by accident in the version I had, but I was alerted to that because the machine readable file was correct. So the texts themselves seem to be surprisingly, well done, and this is because they're double keyed, in very cheap ways across the world. The metadata is incomplete. In most of these files. And so part of the workflows for Markdown annotation that we have is verification of metadata. The number of works seemed impossible to ever get through in a lifetime, because there's so many different versions. And I'm thinking now we can probably get through a third of them. I'm not sure about the metadata, but I'm certainly on Markdown, within the ERC period. But that suggests that it's not an infinite problem. It's like a 10-year problem. If we have a bit of resources. And, in terms of, what quality those different versions are, it's the same problems in print. These are machine readable files created off of the same problematic print editions we might have. So, we can't claim to improve what's in print, but on the other hand, we can give choice to which someone uses. And in my own experience, you're stuck with whatever's in a library. This way people can actually be critical about choice, if we can really get through it.
I have a question to first Wasim and then to Sarah. Wasim, you said that many librarian jobs, subject librarian jobs, who specialize in Middle Eastern studies have been abolished. Many people's jobs are now basically, they have been laid off. So what happens to them? Where do they end up? Has there been any study done? It's quite depressing to find out that one is now abundant and doesn't have a job. So it should be very depressing.
It didn't happen quite like that. I mean, there were restructuring, and because of the restructuring, there were some people that stayed on. So they weren't doing the same role as they were doing before, but they're still employed by the same university. Some obviously one that didn't really like the new role, so they moved to a different university. So that university, they're doing some general library work in some different subject, which weren't their passion or what they were doing before. Or some have just resigned. They may have found other jobs. But most of the time, it was when somebody retired, they didn't. The library didn't go about trying to replace the person that had retired or resigned.
Sarah, Professor Sarah.
Yeah.
If I understood your project, I'm not sure if I understood, but I'll ask the question. I think, as I understood, that your project is about looking at text and looking at the frequency of common words in two different texts. Is that true?
Not exactly. No, that's one of the types of data we can collect off of the corpus, and that's important for text reuse algorithms. But it's not the basis. We're studying the patterns of reuse across all texts. So, for example, I'm personally interested in the patterns in which material from pre-Islamic Iran passes, so that to the extent that you can tag portions of texts and see how, compare them analytically across many, and find ones that you didn't know existed in genres that you didn't think had historical material.
Yeah, but pattern for pattern, you need to see the frequencies, isn't it? You cannot make a pattern without any, any substantial organized pattern. So there should be a frequency of words or something. There
we have
some basis on making that pattern. So what is that? What is the basis for making that pattern?
Yeah, I think we're talking about two different types of data. So right now in GitHub we have, and we're creating an n-gram reader. So we'll have, like you can do for Google n-grams. We're creating such a thing for Arabic books. So we have on GitHub now all the files for frequencies of words online. So you can look any book up and say, oh, it's interesting. Min and man is always, it seems like always the most frequent word. But of course, what is it? Min and man. But the data that I'm talking about that's interesting, I think, is more the equivalent of what we do with anti-plagiarism software. Is where we find these common substantial portions of text. And I think there's, and it's a completely somewhat random guess, but there's about 20,000 files of 1 million that are really interesting and substantial relationships between two books in our corpus. And those need to be studied, to see. And historians have always done that. I mean, historians, by which I mean a very broad collection of people who do Arabic studies, who do actual, literature, people who work on tafsir and Quran, etc. But these, you can see that there's a lot of intertextuality in the tradition. And on that basis, one of our types of data that I didn't show today deals with networks, for example. So you can then take the pairwise and you can abstract to a further level and track the networks of people and how they're related to each other. So that's the kind of stuff that's interesting to us.
Okay, I think probably a coffee break now. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions and have a discussion after the coffee. Thank you.
The time of the concluding remarks, and maybe we'll open the floor for more discussions, more questions. But before we start, I'd love to thank few people who helped us to make this event happen. First of all, our lovely volunteers. You saw them many times today. Thank you very much for their help. And, thank you very much. Yeah, really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Also, I would like to thank the communication team, Layal and Alexandra, my colleagues in the library, Khadija, Pedro, sitting all the day here, Bahab from the IT for making this happen in the room, the all IT and the webcast. So briefly, I just would like to jump to the concluding remarks, and I made the scribble. I couldn't catch everything from the presentations. But I mean, as you might have witnessed, and I was saying in the morning, it's the event the previous events and the initiatives that I mentioned in my introduction was sending alarm bell to us as librarians, to curators, to academics even, about the field, the state of the field, Islamic Studies, librarianship. But today we saw it. I mean, practically, we saw some experiences, challenges, and how we could overcome these challenges. Perhaps few frustrations, of course, that we've witnessed. But the key word amongst all of them was the collaboration. How we all can work together to make this happen and to make the field more prosperous. Starting from Arnold's keynote speech, very, very deep and deep analysis even of the field and what's going on, and between the librarians and academics and the audience even, and the patron or the clients that we are serving. Looking at Paul, mashallah, the experience and the long experience and insights from the field and from his own experience and knowledge as well, sharing his knowledge. Also, David was, and by the way, I know David long time ago, and can I say the nickname? David, I call him Ibn Battuta. Every time I speak to him or I chat with him, he tells me that he is somewhere else in the world. Indonesia, Malaysia, Mali, Nairobi, somewhere, some other places I didn't know even that they are exist in the world.
I always answer.
Yeah, your always answer is you're collecting pivotal collections, pivotal material. Yeah, I like it, pivotal materials. And how you get to know these materials, first of all, and how you convince people to let it out. That's the second question. So this is a very good example. And even when I used to teach in Cairo University, I used to mention David, although I didn't know him at that time, that look at this person who's just collecting and never complained that he doesn't have budget. He never complained that he has obstacle from his boss or whatever. We are on air, but don't worry. Yeah, he never complained. He said, "Just give me a ticket. I will get the material and come back to the library." And I'm still certain that most of his collection that he built at UCLA is still waiting for cataloging. And I think they will need more 5-10 years to finish it. Inshallah. And in the second panel, I think the balance was created. The hope came back. We brought back the hope to us and to the field, starting with Gregor, talking about the important bibliography index Islamicus and the importance of bibliographical works in our life. It's not important only for librarians, but it's important for the field of study, any field of study. You can't start without having a bibliography or a list of resources or publications. And then we see my dear colleague, putting us and facing a fact that the field needs an academic support from the other side of the world. I mean, universities are not thinking about this field in a positive way, so they are cutting down everything. The programs, the personnel, and so on and so forth. And luckily enough, we had in the room the CILIB representative of the accreditation program and building library programs and things. I think she took a few notes before she leave, which is very positive and good. Ending with Sarah kindly agreed to participate in the seminar because I wanted to bring another insight. The Kitab project is one thing, but she's a historian as well. She's a scholar in the field, she's well established, and she knows what libraries mean, what resources in Islamic studies and Middle Eastern studies mean. So I just wanted to gather these few thoughts, and I will leave the floor open for you for a discussion, any questions for our eminent speakers, and perhaps because I'll use the Middle Eastern style and go ahead and use the stage and ask the first question. So we saw many challenges, many frustrations, but I think the fundamental question that we need to ask is what we are lacking here. There is something that we need to put our finger on. What's the field, this field, profession, whatever area study is lacking nowadays, so we are facing all of these problems. I will leave this question with the panelists, and then the floor are welcome to ask any questions. Thank you very much. Answer is yours. Just to bring the mic. Yes. I think it's on now. It's on. I'm not. Yes, please.
Well, maybe what is lacking here is an awareness of how universities have changed, not only in numbers of students or the reduction in staff, but that the whole business model of universities has changed during the last decade. It is no longer an institution for the privileged younger generation, but a mass education system, and it's based on economic premises rather than cultural or educational premises. The way universities earn money by turning out students as if they were cattle, for instance. And I think the whole economic premise of the university has to be considered to give an answer to many problems we are facing right now in terms of expertise, the value of expertise. So don't you need any expertise at all in a modern university? That is, I think, a big problem.
Those of you who heard my presentation won't be surprised by that. I think librarians, if we're going to be talking about that principally, they're going to need to adapt. The traditional way of doing things means that you refine what you've done before, you make the catalogue ever better. That, I don't think, is going to work. I thought, interesting, what the sort of thing that's happening is the sort of projects that Sarah is doing, which are complex, which require programming, software, subject knowledge. There are a huge variety of things, and librarians have to be able to insert themselves into these sorts of projects. For example, on the public engagement side, where you have actually to find out who the people are who are going to use this, and are the librarians the people who help, if there's anything required, to train them to use this, and to show them what the things can do. I think most people now, all the user surveys I look at suggest self-searching is the way that people do things, apart from the older generation who will still battle away with databases, etc., and will try complex search strategies and Boolean analysis and all the rest of it. Most people just want to press a button and find out what there is. And what librarians have to do, have to find ways to approach these people and find out how they can give added value to their searches, that there's more to life than just pressing a button. I haven't got the magic answer about how to say what it is, but the thing is, you do have, what David said, you need face-to-face contact. He was talking mainly about acquisitions, but that's entirely true of dealing with your patrons and your clients as well. Get to know everyone. That's the only way that you can persuade people that you can add value to what they're doing. And get involved, I'm afraid, in the projects that you know are going in, where you can add. Even if it's way out of your field. I didn't understand some of the technical things, and the final slide, or the penultimate slide, where you showed about 5 different pieces of software. You said you have about 30 different programs running. That's complex, but librarians have a part to play in this. And that's where you have to work. So that's my idea. We have to change because our audience, our public has changed. So we've got to change with them.
I think we need to find more ways to bring the public into the library. I mean, we can have wonderful e-collections, but we do have these library buildings, and we have to do something with them that will make them attractive to the public. And all different spectra of the public, yeah, the youth, the older people, and perhaps involve some of our less traditional collections in order to attract people into the library. One of the main things that we're going to be working on at my new library is to have a lot of public programming and trying to, we have a stage that will house 570 people, so we should be able to have some nice public programming. But what kind of materials will bring the public in? What kind of activities will bring them in? I mean, we thought maybe about having cooking shows, having things like a lot of, and now I see in a lot of libraries, these do-it-yourself DIY. So how can we make these events more attractive to our public? Just a couple of random thoughts.
I know this is something that Qatar National Library is dealing a lot with. They have knitting clubs that are meeting in QNL. And they have lots of children's events, loads of children's events. And some of it is book-oriented, but some of it's not so book-oriented. And, your first thought, is I do feel myself to be, I didn't come of age in this digital era, originally. I thought, knitting club? Really? A knitting club in a library? What's that about? And then you realize actually a library is a space, and it teaches a sort of focus of mind that actually so much of the internet and all the apps, etc., destroys. So knitting is a rather nice, I think, activity to have in the library. I was thinking of my son. So Reddit is, he does Reddit, and the number of people who get on these apps, these social media things. I mean, millions of hits for the silliest small things, and I think the challenge is to take the phone reader, the person reading a text on a phone, and the person who's getting entertained through things like Reddit and other social media, and then to channel it into something more deep and meaningful and focused. So.
I see a lot of interest in coding now. Some libraries are offering courses in coding for the kids. So it's not my thing, but it seems to be something which is high on the radar of many.
Yeah, and my 9-year-old's coding.
Really? Wow.
Schools now. Start Python.
Any questions then?
Cooking and coding.
My question is to David. Is there any particular reason why the collection you collected they're not catalogued yet?
It doesn't have copy. It means that another library has not already cataloged it. So the libraries usually prefer to catalog things that already have been cataloged by another library because they can add them easily to the collection.
So they're not ready to catalog them?
No, they will catalog it, but it's not, since a lot of the materials that I would acquire are gifts, their top priority is always for things that have been paid for, and then the second is for things that they can easily add into the collection. Now, fortunately, I had a good relationship with our cataloging department, and I could bring things down to them and say, please, could you get this into the collection? Or if I could find a faculty member who was interested in a particular subject, I would say, well, this is for such and such a faculty member, and then it would get done. So there are many reasons why things don't get cataloged. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. First question is to David. As Walid as well said, you are kind of Ibn Battuta. So when you are somewhere in the world and suddenly you find an interesting material, reading text, reading just the title of it, how do you decide if it's worth collecting?
Well, I guess it's just a feeling that I have. If I can usually have access to some kind of bibliographic utility like OCLC or my library catalog. So I can check and see, is this how many libraries is this held by? Is it an interesting subject? I don't always look for something which is necessarily high academic scholarship. I like a lot of things that are produced by smaller publishers and by individuals that are not necessarily that easy to find. So if I found that it was not available in most libraries, and there were a few specific libraries that I had in mind, if they didn't have it, then I would make sure to get it and then say to them, see what I picked up. There's a little bit of friendly competition involved.
So you just check at the availability and unavailability,
yeah, and
or
also,
the number of times that material has been referred.
No, I can't
Popularity
say,
of that.
I can't say that I rely on citation indexes to decide if I'm going to buy a book.
And do you digitalize as well when you find a material just to save the postal?
So, some things digitize when I find it on Insight, or digitize it when I take it back to the library.
Okay.
Which one? Do I digitize it when I find it,
yes.
or do I digitize it when I bring it back?
I mean, starting from there,
The only time I would digitize something out in the field is if it was not something that I could acquire and take back. because the digitization that I would do would not be the same quality that I was able to do back at my institution. And I wasn't carrying a large digital camera with me. Does that answer?
Is there any other questions? I'll come back to you.
First of all, may I say thank you to the panel for the presentations. I have two questions. One is really arising from the presentation this morning, and that is what I found common there was the initiatives that the librarians themselves took outside of their job description, so to speak, and perhaps giving vent to their academic instincts, perhaps. Would you think that that will be now, with this new structure and new setup, something that would recede as we go through? I mean, we have wonderful publications by curators. Will that now be less? This is just a question. The other one has to do with a particular subject, and that is music. It has started, I think, a few years ago, about a decade or 2 decades ago, that we have been having CDs in the library, and gradually. Now, is music something that you think would be given provision within the library as such, both acquisition and study?
To start there.
Yes, this morning we came to some sort of conclusion that it's always important to have people wishing to explore the boundaries of what is possible. This has always been so in the past, and I think it will be exactly the same in the future. We are not the last of a generation, last of the heroes.
Right.
We are just one generation, and we will be succeeded by another generation, and it will continue with resourceful and inventive people who will take the torch and carry it on, I think. So I don't see any change there. They will work in different circumstances that we cannot even predict now, because everything will be changing faster and faster. But the mentality of the people, of resourceful people, intelligent people, will always be the same, to be independent of mind and spirit. So I see no change there. It was, well, about your second question, if music will become more important, so the preservation, for instance. Well, preservation is a problem. Well, for instance, with cassette tapes, they don't last forever, so they have to be digitized. If there will be more research on music, probably, I don't know. If anybody else knows.
I think there are a lot of universities that have specialized music libraries, and some of them have even had people that have a background with Arabic. The previous head of the music library at Harvard University, who subsequently went to the New York University in Abu Dhabi, was herself a music librarian, and she wrote a book about Kulthum. Her name is Ginny Danielson. So she was certainly interested in collecting music materials for her library there. I dare say that there are others. I know that the University of California in Santa Barbara has digitized a lot of old wax cylinders and older vinyl records and made them available digitally, and including Arabic materials. So I don't think it's something that's universally collected, but I think a lot of libraries are interested in expanding their music collections, and including sheet music. So.
Yeah, shortly before I retired, I was asked if I could help with a particular project. It was the widow of the late Lenny Lewison who wanted it. Lenny Lewison, a fine scholar. Mrs. Lewison is a specialist, though, in music and folk poetry, that sort of thing. And she had acquired, I'm not sure what, I think it was in tape format, lots of material from Iran from the 1950s that was broadcast. Now, my expertise is not in that area of transferring from one medium to another medium. So I think the moral I'm drawing for this is that I think possibly the very wide subject knowledge that many Middle Eastern librarians had maybe become less important than their ability to collaborate technologically with other formats. I mean, other queries I was asked about, there's a Kurdish newspaper in Sorani Kurdish. How do you do optical character recognition in Kurdish? Well, we heard it's a problem in Persian. Kurdish is another grade above that because it has yet more characters, as does Urdu, I think. So there's always going to be questions asked, and I think librarians will get asked more and more of these sorts of questions, and they have to be ready, if they don't know the answer, to either learn about them or work with lots of other people to produce collaborative solutions. I think the answer where you can just do it out of your own knowledge or from reference works is probably gone. I think we have to become more technologically savvy. That's my opinion.
Just about the first question that you asked about whether it's possible, still possible for librarians to go out of their way to bring to deal. I mean, like our role masters here, they very fortunate enough. When we look at general of the universities where they no longer have a subject librarian, I think for them it will be because those people, if they have a background in the field, and they'll be more passionate about finding new material. But if we have generic librarians, I think we'll see we may not get you probably won't see that type of collection building as you would see if the librarian has a background in the field.
One last brief remark. I think every librarian leaves their own imprint on a collection. Everyone has their own special interests. I mean, there are certain things that we have to acquire, which are just standard materials, core materials for a library. But as I mentioned earlier, my predecessor at UCLA, Dunning Wilson, he was definitely most interested in Persian. I had more of an interest in Arabic. I had more of an interest in the Arab world, more of an interest perhaps in the Gulf states. So everyone leaves their own imprint.
That's your water. Keep it can we take a few questions from, because I was aware that online people are asking questions. Yes, just give me a second. Any questions online?
You can find someone in the meantime.
Okay. So question from internet.
Question for David. Has any graduate student done any research on the material that you shipped back to the States? Maybe written anything about them or the collections available to the graduate students?
Yes, I've definitely had inquiries about things that I acquired, sometimes from faculty and sometimes from students. The comic books that I acquired from the Arab world were definitely of interest. I noticed that they're checked out. Every once in a while I check in the catalog to see if materials that I had acquired are checked out. Textbooks.
So they are available even though they are not cataloged?
Okay, anything that is cataloged is available. So things that are not cataloged, sometimes I managed, if it was a serial, any kind of a periodical, then I would enter a brief record for someone to, so that it could be found. And sometimes people would request them. If you request something, they will rush catalog it.
Okay.
So
one question from, could you talk a little bit about the Quran that you carbon dated, how many sheets of Qurans you found?
Yeah.
And whether it is a complete Quran or not?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
My part in this project was really very modest. We have a very small collection of about 7 Quran leaves from the second half of the 7th century CE. What I did was participate in a very large project that involves very much larger collections kept in Berlin, Tübingen, Cairo and Paris. And these are hundreds and hundreds of old fragments based on old codices, old books. The project is basically concerned with a reconstruction, making a critical edition of the Quran text on the basis of these old fragments. So my part was really minimal, but I wanted to attract the attention of the public to this discovery and to point out that possessing even such a limited amount of documents is relevant for our study of Islam, and that we should be proud to have such a collection in one of our Dutch libraries. So that was my point, but it fell foul with other people in the faculty, and I really couldn't help that. The point that really made people angry is that I said, well, there are 2 opposite statements in this whole affair. There are people who say that the Quran was concocted about 100 years after the age of Muhammad, if he ever existed at all. And on the other side, there is the viewpoint of Orthodox Islam with the codification under the rule of the Caliph Osman and so forth. And I said, if you look at these 2 opposites, I think the Orthodox view is more relevant if you look at the results of these tests, and that really upset a lot of people. But as I said to Sarah, you have these strange opinions among right-wing politicians. Many politicians say that the Prophet Muhammad was an impostor and people who had sex with little girls and things like that. But you can't have it both. You cannot say the Prophet Muhammad never existed or he was a villain. So that is a basic problem. So does that answer your question? You had a second question, but I forgot what it was. Okay.
No questions online. Okay. Any further questions?
Hi. Actually, I would have a question for Gregor in regard to, it's maybe a comment, more than a question, but I mean, I was wondering about the responsibility of Index Islamicus as a bibliography towards how Islamic studies are developing. And obviously, I mean, we've seen with Arnold how much they are under constraint, and we know how much they are under constraint in the UK. And I was just wondering how Index Islamicus as a bibliography that kind of harvests publication from lots of different channels and also kind of lesser recognized or sometimes not at all recognized by big index harvester like Scopus, for example, which are the bases that are used for researcher nowadays to kind of list, how much they make impact on the research impact or whatever. I mean, this is listed against what is listed in Scopus, for example. And I was wondering if Index Islamicus couldn't actually play a bigger role for Islamic studies scholars and how Islamic librarians, Islamic studies librarians could actually help in kind of bringing Islamic scholars to the fore and showing that their research was actually as important and basically having them indexed in a way that was as validated, I would say, than other fields of research. So it's not really a question, but I was wondering how, Index Islamicus could actually help in that matter, and how Islamic studies librarians could help kind of make a stronger case for all this publication from Islamic studies scholars, so they can actually have a way to say, okay, we have published, and we have published in publication or in journals that are not actually being indexed in Scopus. So it's not, maybe marked down for the next research excellence framework. So it's problematic. It's really impacting the whole career. It impacts on the whole field. So I'm just wondering, basically, how, as a commercial company, you can help, and how that can be more, maybe, this responsibility could be dispersed with Islamic studies librarians as well.
It's not a very clear question. I'm just wondering how we could work towards basically making that work better for Islamic studies scholars with our tools. All right.
I'm sorry. Silly questions on Facebook.
Very tricky question.
Yeah, sorry. But I was wondering. Is this your responsibility? Maybe this is a question.
Traditionally it has been, and as you know, there are still people working for the Index Islamicus who have been working for the last 2-3 decades. Their policy has always been to be comprehensive, to index everything, and so it is quite complicated to convince everybody that the time has come to be selective. So to introduce certain criteria like quality, scholarly level of publications, and also to make things more visible which are not included in these big indexing bodies. I would like to strive in this direction, but there are several obstacles. You need people working for Index Islamicus within the team who have certain competencies. So the range of subject areas we are covering brings automatically with it that even people who have studied Islamic studies don't have competencies in all the subfields, while they are indexing in all the subfields. So if I'm indexing about Muslims in Sri Lanka, unless I read the piece, it is very difficult for me to see what actually the contribution to scholarship is. But I mean, we try our utmost really to undermine the importance given to scholarship, to ranking scholarship, to giving value, to marking the quality of scholarship done by these big indexing bodies. So we are really consciously trying to find publications done in countries which are usually not monitored by those indexing bodies, but even there it is difficult to be systematic, to make sure that we still lack man and woman power to index, to really be up to date with all the core publications. There are always areas we are lacking.
So that's why I wonder, how you could harness basically all the kind of knowledge of the librarians that have been working. And I wonder if Index Islamicus shouldn't be coming back from its commercial venture to its academic roots, basically. Or librarianship that has this kind of, it's obviously not a question you can answer.
Yes, I would be ill-advised to answer these questions, because these are really other people who have to take initiatives in that direction. Because if I was unrestricted in defining the direction the project is going, if I was unrestricted by financial consideration, then I would certainly take that on board, but under the present circumstances, that is quite limited, how far it can go.
I have one question online. I think that someone failed to send us the question on the webcast portal, and smart enough, he just used Facebook, which is good. Osama Mahmoud from Egypt, and the question is for Kitab Project or Dr. Sarah, and he's just suggesting that you're working on the reuse of the text of one work or related works. So have you thought about adding another layer of this project to examine works that build on the original work, like istadrakat and other things like interpretations, different abridged copies, and you know, Bukhari. If you look at Bukhari in the line, you can build a tree of 100 or 200 or 300 works built on Bukhari.
Yeah.
So that's just a comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is sort of the research question, I guess. But the so we I have a monograph I'm finishing this year based on the lectures I gave in Leiden in 2017. And one of the arguments I'm making is that broadly speaking, the reuse stats that we have now for the whole corpus point to a view of the Arabic tradition is a commentarial tradition. And the characteristic that there's many different ways in which authors are using, reusing, and effectively commenting on each other. There's this interconnectedness, you know, of the tradition at large. And so, for example, you know, there's many cases of, you know, of a work being, you know, the issue of mukhtasar, you know, how we think of these abridgments and how does abridgment actually work? Well, we can graphically show it, but we need to investigate it. You know, we can show through that diagram that I have, you know, the relationship between what gets cut and broken down, but then the sort of editorial principles that lie behind that, you know, as a point of investigation. So, I mean, absolutely. No, there's no question. I mean, there's been a lot of research projects. This is, you know, this issue of what is a book has been around for a very long time, as we all know. And you know, there's a lot of European projects looking at similar issues on like the book and extracts, you know, and it's another sort of frame. But yes, so no, I'm quite alive to that, and I personally am quite interested in it. So I've looked at Tabari being reused, and then the reuse of Tabari's reuse.
Yeah. Can you check if there are any questions for people that didn't ask before they yet? I'll come back to you, just to give opportunity for others to run online. We found it?
We have one.
This is a question about your acquisition and selection processes for those of you who do purchases or did purchase. I'm curious to know if you're not lucky enough to actually travel to the countries to get books, and you don't use your vendors' approval plans to send you books that they've chosen, in what way would you make selections where we have a dearth of information online or provided by our booksellers about what these books are about? There's no abstracts. I'm talking about Arabic, Persian, Turkish, mostly Arabic and Persian books. So we have very little information about what these books are, who their authors are, and it's very difficult to find this information out online. So how would you go about making a selection? So that's the first question. Second part is, I know a lot of libraries do actually rely on big vendors, and often we have a few vendors who dominate the market from the Arab world and the Middle East. If you do rely on them, isn't there a risk that we're all getting the same books? And isn't there a danger that we're missing out big chunks of academia because vendors are the ones who are doing the selection for us? And then thirdly, there's a question for Paul. You talked about the need for collaboration and Malcolm International, Malcolm UK. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we can make specifically Malcolm UK something of value, seeing that we're such few of us left in the field in the UK, and what can it actually bring if, you know, there's not many of us left, basically. Thank you.
David?
I see you.
In my brain. Right. Well, I mean, we don't really have that much choice in terms of acquiring things from the Middle East. There are a certain number of vendors out there, and I mean, if you start with someone new, you don't know how reliable they're going to be. So there are certain ones which we have found to be reliable for certain countries. I don't think that there are reliable vendors for every country. And when we don't just have a generic approval plan, we tell them which subject areas we want and how deeply we want to cover. So if there's a library that's particularly interested in fiqh, they will tell the vendor we want to have a comprehensive collection in fiqh. If there's someone who wants to collect an Arabic poetry, or maybe only Arabic poetry from a particular country, you can specify that. But if you try and buy from individual publishers and individual authors, your acquisitions department will hate you. And they have very reason, because if you have one vendor that will be your main jobber, your main vendor to supply from an individual country, that means you make one check instead of writing 50 checks. It's just a matter of practicality. If you have an opportunity to go to the countries in addition, then you can supplement what you order. But I don't think there's any, I don't have any easy answer for that.
Yeah, please. Well, I stopped acquiring modern books ever since 2005 when I became curator for special collections. But in the years that I was assistant curator, I was responsible for acquiring Middle Eastern books. I always went to the Cairo Book Fair.
Yeah.
Took along.
She said if you don't have the
went to the Dutch Institute, and hired the Institute chauffeur's son. And he went along with me with a trolley, and we picked up anything we liked, and we shipped it home, which was strictly speaking illegal, but everything is always illegal in Middle Eastern countries. It went in the diplomatic bag. So it was about 500, 600 books every year, but as a result, we have a lot of books that you will not find anywhere else. Because many libraries do business with exactly the same vendors, like Layla Bookshop in Cairo. As a result, that you find the same books in every library. Also based on this same principle that libraries like to acquire books that have been catalogued by somebody else. So they end up with the same books. And this is expressed in the number of interlibrary loans that we get, because we acquire materials that other libraries don't. There may be a solution in that. But also in this case, our management is interfering in this system because they have now they switched to approval plans under my successor, and now they've come up with the ideas that all books from the Middle East should be acquired through the Dutch Institute in Rabat, in Morocco. And there's little you can do about that. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, I really don't know.
Yeah. Well, I use the Library of Congress Middle East to call Collaborative Acquisitions Plan, MICAP, I think. That's very expensive, but it does give you access to material that vendors in Cairo are not going to find. And they do take a very long time to come, and I said it doubles the price. But again, you are sticking with one check, so you pay the money up front and you could spend up to that amount. That's one way of doing it. The other thing is that, as we've noticed, there are so few British libraries now. I mean, which countries do you want to acquire from? Where are the strengths of your postgraduates? Where are they researching? It's often worth talking to postgraduates, particularly from the countries they come from, about resources that they think they should be able to acquire. I'm not suggesting you don't give money to the students, but they often have ideas about where you can get things and what you should be and what can be bought. They know probably their own country's book market far better than we do back in the UK. So that's another possibility. And thirdly, and this is a difficult one, there are online sites. I mean, you can buy books from Saudi Arabia quite easily if you have a credit card. Now, library administrations hate librarians having credit cards for obvious reasons, you know. I mean, you could go out of control. But there are ways. What you can do is look at the online sites like Owaysat or something, and you can actually see what's been published. And if you've got students working in that field, wherever it happens to be, you can actually track down, let's say, books and hadith published in Saudi Arabia. I don't know, but there are quite more and more sites now which tell you what's been published. I said, use your postgraduate's knowledge if you can, and you could always use something like MICAP or another bookseller who specializes in an area that isn't normally acquired. Most people acquire books from Lebanon and Cairo, yes? Yes. Well, there are plenty of other countries, you know, and some of their books are very, very good, particularly North African books can be very scholarly, so could Saudi. Everyone can be. So that's it. But the other question you asked me, what do you do when there are only 3 of you in the world? You know, I don't know, but I was very impressed, I mean, by all the digital work that's been done on the manuscript between Oxford and Cambridge, and the sort of work Peter Colwyn's done for SOAS. And I think that is something, if you're down to a one-man band or a one-person band, then all you can do is work with other people to produce more of those things, because people do want to know, do want to get access to the manuscripts. It's really good, particularly with good metadata. The more manuscripts you can digitize, the better it is. If you don't go to manuscripts, you can think of other smaller specialist collections, Ottoman books, which are well long out of copyright. I mean, some of them have been done in Germany, but there's plenty of other things you can do collaboratively that might be worthwhile doing. If there are only a few of you, provided there's a grant behind you and you're happy to handle the digital software stuff. So that's really, I think, all probably you can do. And keep talking to each other and have fun going to Naples. Yeah. That's the next one, isn't it?
Yes.
Just
on the same note, I just wanted to mention that this was one of the, not a dilemma, but how we were thinking about our digitization project at the Aga Khan Library. Do we start with manuscripts, which is widely spread now, many digitization projects? Do we focus on the rare books only? And as Paul mentioned, we decided to start our first phase to digitize the Ottoman collection that we have in the library. Although it's a bit difficult to make selections, but we were fortunate to receive a donation dedicated only for this project, and we are in the process of making our selections to post online in the very near future.
Just one brief follow-up about acquisitions.
Yes, please. Perhaps it would be the last comment, if you don't.
Just both Paul and I believe Arnold had mentioned graduate students. So sometimes graduate students go home to their home countries. Sometimes you can convince them to look for things for you. Also, if you have students from your own university that are going to study overseas, sometimes you can get them to you say, this is an area that you are interested in, maybe help us out instead of just getting things for yourself. And we have our faculty that go on leave, on Fulbright scholarships or other various things. So some are more cooperative than others, but it's always something to consider.
Can I add that we at Aga Khan Library, we use the same approach for resources that it's difficult to buy remotely or to ship or to pay for and things. I have lots of faculty members who travel everywhere, students who go for their field trips every year. Then we ask them if they spotted anything that of relevance to our work or to their research even. They recommend it to us, and then we have an online discussion, and then we can ask them to acquire it for us. Or it works very, very well, because even they pay for it and wait until they come back and we refund. So it works very good with us as well, this approach.
Yes, but books are very heavy.
They are, they are so kind.
Sometimes they can ship them, sometimes they're willing to do one suitcase. There have been times when I even paid for them to bring back a suitcase.
Yes, that's
overweight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think with a very happy note, I think now I see people are smiling, which is good. So I think this seminar is brought to a conclusion now, and I hope that we can carry on this connection and collaboration in the future. And I hope we see you all in the Aga Khan Library in near future. We have a tour for like 20, 50 minutes. Anyone is interested to visit the library, please speak to Wasim, Pedro, or my colleague Shah over there. Then we can take you to the library to see the significant architecture and the collection that we have over 2 floors in this building. And thank you very much, and thank you for our speakers and for their help. Thank you very much.